So hey guys, what if Naruto was in Twilight Vampire? So let's start the series. Being a veteran of the Civil War in 1861, Jasper Hale had witnessed many things in his human lifespan and even more as one of the undead. While his parents were a contributing factor in his upbringing, his fighting techniques and strategic attitude was based purely on his military training. From the very beginning of his military career, he was taught to dispatch the enemy quickly and efficiently. There was only one time in his life when he witnessed a soldier who chose to not follow his orders. Too many had died that night. As it is now, over 100 years later, he continues to watch over his new family in silence, choosing instead to observe his surroundings for possible enemies and the like, rather than bringing attention to himself. Jasper had taken the role of strategist in their little wayward group and had fallen into the niche amazingly well because of his previous life. Survival was always at the forefront of his mind, not just for himself, but for his family as well. He was able to figure out quickly that all humans were mind-numbingly predictable everywhere they went. They would flock around his family and he, needing to get closer. It was, he supposed, due to the abilities of being what they were. They were designed to draw their prey in with their pretty features and overall mysteriousness from not mingling with the others. Due to his precautions, they have been able to successfully avoid any possible dangers and anything unexpected. That is until they met one, Nate Riven. Never once in his life had Jasper met someone like the teenager. He was an absolute and complete enigma, one he would see trying to make an effort to appear as normal as possible, and would most of the time succeed, if someone wasn't watching closely as he was. Nate reacted to situations differently from other mortals they had seen. Even Bella had yet to confuse him in such a way. Flashback. Is something the matter, Nate? Bella asked when she caught him looking at Alice for the 20th time that day from his notebook. He blinked owlishly in confusion when the entire Cullen family looked back at the two, knowing he had been caught. Instead of answering though, he sighed and after a few moments snapped his fingers in conclusion. He looked at Alice. You don't see things, do you? He asked and reiterated when he saw the family's gobsmacked expressions, like making predictions or, "We knew what you meant, man. We're just wondering how you knew," Emmett said, and Nate chuckled. "That's for me to know, Emmett. And for us to find out?" The brawny vampire finished the common phrase when Nate paused, but the blonde only chuckled and continued to draw and write in the book he was holding. And flashback. Strangely enough, even with the secrecy the blonde seemed to exude, Jasper felt a sort of kinship with Nate. Both were products of a war. All the signs leading to his conclusion were in the open. It was there in his fluid movement, how his gaze was always flitting to and from people in the area, looking for anything unusual, how he never let his guard down, even when it seemed to all others he had. He could even hear a vague sound of metal clinking together from the pouches he was so adamant in carrying with him. Nate had kept a tight lid on just what he was capable of, but it wasn't until an incident that took place just outside the small Port Angeles Mall. Even to this day, Emmett would spontaneously laugh when something happened that reminded him it. It was the day Nate had accompanied the Cullen family. As it turns out, Esme could be pretty persuasive when she wanted to be. Once she had heard he needed to pick up a few things, it was agreed they would all go together. Flashback. Well, looky here, boys. We got ourselves a few dames. A fat man and his cronies leered as they neared the mall entrance. We'll show you a real good time if you come with us. Nate glared at the group. Just ignore them, it's not worth it, Esme muttered and pulled on Nate's hand to bring him along. What you staring at, boy? Don't tell me you want some too? The man erupted in belly-shaking laughs and Esme had to pull harder on Nate's hand. Once they left the group, the tension immediately left, and everyone was as chipper as before. Oh, I can't wait. We need to get you some more clothes, Nate. You can't always walk around in that mess you seem to like wearing, and you're in luck. I helped Bella pick out some of her best outfits. Alice chirped as everyone made their way inside and Nate saw the sympathetic looks being shot his way, especially by Bella. He chuckled, "Sorry, Pixie, but I'm not here for clothes that are easily shredded. No matter how fashionable they are." He looked away as she pouted. "I'm not falling for that either." "Good try, though." He moved out of her reach when she tried to make a grab for him and started towards a building across from the mall, thankful they were in public where she couldn't do much. "Fine. Geez, you try and help a guy," she muttered as Nate's form became a mere dot to human vision. Once inside, the family had split up, each going their own separate ways, and decided once they were done they would meet back at the car. Within an hour the family had come back together, Alice skipping, while her husband carried the vast bags with her purchases and placed them in the back of their car. "Where's Nate? You don't think he got lost, do you?" she asked once she reached the rest of her family, sans Edward and Bella. As soon as the words left her mouth they heard a sharp whistle from across the way and saw the large man from before, along with his cronies, chasing the blonde as he ran parallel to the highway, a plastic bag clutched tightly in his grip. Jasper and Emmett moved to aid the blonde, but stopped when Alice shook her head, a bright smile decorating her face. "He can handle this one on his own," she answered, and looked back to watch the show in glee. Rosalie scoffed. "It's that tub of lard again," she hissed. "I swear the standards in this city have plummeted." Both Emmett and Jasper growled in agreement. They noticed that whatever Nate said back to the man once they cornered him had caused him to turn a rather fetching shade of puce, and then he reached for his bat. "He wouldn't dare!" Esme growled out when she saw him pull it from his jacket and raise it up above the blonde. It was at that point that Nate ducked beneath the fencing and out of their line of sight, before reappearing behind the man as the bat came down. The older man stumbled forward when he hit nothing but air, and Nate didn't give him the chance to recuperate before his foot landed hard on the man's ass with a loud smack. He fell into the fencing, busting it open with his girth, as the others came to the scene. Seeing them, Nate grinned and expertly hopped over the railing as they approached. The Cullens knew this area well enough to know that below Nate was a 30-foot drop, but he didn't seem deterred by the fact. The others slowed, seeing the maniacal look the blonde was now sporting, thinking he might have been suicidal and was going to jump to the ground below them. Nate never was one to disappoint, and he did just that. Gasps rang out from those in the parking lot that noticed the group and had been watching since, as he jumped and perched himself onto one of the metal beams acting as support to a few buildings below them. He gave a cheery wave and ran along it with amazing balance before leaping to a beam lower down and from there to the roof of a small bakery. By now he was still a good 10 feet from the ground, and the people below looked on in amazement, and some in slight hysterics when he didn't stop and made the last jump, landing at the bottom with a slight roll to take the impact off from his feet. Nate's head jerked up when that infernal whistle sounded, seeing the fat man on his tail once again. It seemed like Jumbo wasn't as dumb as he looked. He figured out about the maintenance ladder pretty quickly and made good use of it. Nate jogged in the opposite direction, allowing the others to close the distance before actually running across a few of the railings on a wheelchair ramp. Now he was a good 10 feet below them. He watched as his attackers paused and began to run around the entirety of the system, keeping their gaze on the blonde. Nate grinned when they were a few feet from catching him and ran back across the railing to the point they started from. He sighed when all 4 cronies caught back up to him, and scared at how out of shape they were. "Really, boys, is that all you have? Frankly, I'm disappointed, and after all that talk," he reprimanded when the fat one ran at him with a yell, the bat still in his grip. Nate easily grabbed the man's hand and twisted the object from his meaty fist, before bringing his knee up into the man's expansive stomach. He went down like the ogre he was. The Cullens noticed, and Alice clapped jovially. The other 3 paled significantly when a blue gaze turned to face them and looked as if they wanted to run, but were glued to the spot. The older one pulled out a switchblade once he regained motion, and the others circled him, preventing escape. "You just don't learn, do you?" Nate murmured and sunk down into an unfamiliar position, waiting. All 3 ran forward simultaneously, and Nate did a quick leg sweep that brought the first down, and used the remaining momentum to flip his body out of the way of the oncoming knife. He easily brought a foot up that dislodged the knife and sent it into the air above them, while Nate did a backspin kick that smashed the man into the brick wall behind him and knocked him out cold. By this time the man, still recovering from his impact to the ground from the leg sweep, groaned and opened his eyes just in time to see the knife barreling towards him. Nate smirked at the squeal the man gave off upon seeing it, and watched as it embedded itself into the ground a mere centimeter from his head. He passed out when Nate delivered a blow to the side of his head the next moment. As luck would have it, the last man decided whatever they wanted from the blonde wasn't worth the trouble anymore, and started to run. The police sirens in the distance came to a halt as 2 men in tan uniforms looked over the scene, and the other that was running down the sidewalk as if the devil was after him. "Someone's going to have to go get him," one muttered and was about to get back into the car. "Allow me, gentlemen," Nate said, and picked up a hefty, aluminum trash can lid. He tested the weight lightly and finding it satisfactory slung it in the direction of the running man. With precision aimed, the lid sailed over the distance between them and collided with the back of the man's neck, officially putting him out of commission. Emmett could be heard across the way howling with laughter, and nearly doubling over at the mess as the rest of the family walked over to them to make sure Nate wasn't arrested. He was released after a brief chat and a few more eyewitness accounts. Once awake, the fat man started yelling at the blonde, to which Nate replied with a glare that silenced him. "Oh, and lard ass?" Nate called out as the large man was handcuffed. "You owe some friends of mine an apology. Don't make this any harder than it needs to be. Sorry for leering at you," he stuttered out at Rosalie, Alice and Esme before getting into the vehicle. As cool as that was, what was it they wanted? Emmett couldn't help but ask. The plastic bag Nate was holding close to his body. The blonde just handed the bag over wordlessly to allow the brawny vampire access, and he immediately began to rummage through it. "A wad of paper. This is what you were protecting." He snorted and handed it back. "Not just any paper. It's specially treated rice paper that's a little thicker and more durable than others. I thought I wouldn't be able to find it anywhere. There was no way I'd let those fools get their grimy hands on this." "What was that you did?" Jasper had asked as Edward and Bella joined them, ignoring his brother's confused expression. Edward's eyes widened comically when Emmett replayed the entire thing back for him in his mind, and he gave Nate a look of slight awe. For a moment Jasper noticed a brief panicked look enter the blonde's eyes at the question, but it was gone before anyone could question it. "You ever heard of parkour?" 1. Besides the fact that Nate could hold his own in a fight, he also seemed adept at conjuring and wearing many masks that hid his real emotions. While there was genuine happiness, there was always an underlying torrent of negative emotions that swamped the good. The blonde had given him a concerned look when he found out Jasper was an empathic. That was also the day Nate's emotions just vanished when the vampire came into the vicinity, scaring Jasper to no end. It was as if he vanished completely, and when he asked, Nate only replied, "You were in pain because of my thoughtlessness. You're a good friend of mine and I didn't want to see you hurting." He never did reiterate exactly how he shielded his emotions so efficiently. There was also the little problem of Edward not being able to read Nate's mind, just as he couldn't read Bella's. Though his brother couldn't hear anything, he often told them how different the two were. Bella was an invisible and completely impenetrable fortress that blocked her every thought, as if she wasn't even there, while Nate's thoughts were merely shrouded by a wall or a veil. He could tell without a doubt there was something there, just something he couldn't reach. Jasper would often catch his little brother staring at Nate with an expression of longing, it seemed, when he thought the others weren't watching. There was something more between them than the two were saying, and while it was hidden well, there were signs too others of the family had picked up on. Whenever Alice had seen Edward, she would sigh and shake her head, which led Jasper to believe she already knew and was only respecting their privacy. It was a little different when Rosalie found out. At first she denied it, thinking she must have just been imagining things. But when the actions increased and she threatened to burn all of Alice's clothing, she became a part of their little group. It wasn't until Nate and Edward's fight that the three's suspicions of their past became concrete. Flashback. Jasper was leaning against the house, watching as Emmett explained to Nate how one played a video game after hearing the blonde had no idea what it was. "Hold up. So I control my player with a game controller and I tried to kick your ass in this fighting game." Emmett nodded. "What's the point in that when I can kick your ass right now?" Nate asked with a completely innocent face, and Emmett responded with a booming laughter. "You're a funny guy." Now seriously. Edward was at the time watching the interaction between the two, as usual, but emotions of jealousy rolled off him when Emmett slung his massive arm over Nate's shoulders in a huddle-like formation. Once Emmett had declared Nate as being deprived of the finer things in life as a child, and their conversation had ended. The blonde had grabbed the small baseball near Edward. He yelled for Emmett to go long, and in a burst of speed Emmett was 20 feet away, grinning like a man as he made taunting gestures. He didn't catch the sly look as it crossed Nate's features, but Jasper sure did. "Why are you here?" Edward had asked, his tone only a little ways away from seething. "Carlisle wanted to go over a few things." "I thought you knew that already," was the blonde's answer. "No. Why are you here with us? Your work is done, but you're playing with Emmett." Nate saw his point and shrugged. "Dunno, I guess I just like hanging out with you and your family." Besides, Emmett wouldn't let me leave when I asked what a console was. You shouldn't want to hang out with me, Edward tried, but Nate's eyes narrowed at the attempt. Who are you to tell me who I can or can't hang out with? Nate growled out, cutting him off before he could continue. Would you just shut up for one moment? Edward hissed back and barreled on. You shouldn't want to hang out with me. I'm nothing but a monster, he snapped and faced dulled cerulean eyes, before they filled to the brim with contempt, and Nate smirked. With a sardonic laugh Nate replied, Edward, you have no idea what a monster truly is. It's not a term you should be throwing around lightly. Oh, and you do? Nate shrugged again and watched as Edward walked away from him. I'm done trying to warn you. Nate turned towards Emmett again, looking ready to wipe that smug look of the brawny vampire's face, but not before stiffening at the phrase Edward uttered next. Never once had Jasper seen Nate shake with such unrepressed rage. It was something he shouldn't have heard, being as far away as he was, but judging by the blonde's pale pallor, he did. I wish I never fell in love with you. Jasper was vaguely aware of the click in Emmett's jaw as it fell open, his wife's look of pity as she watched from the deck above them, no doubt aware of this before it even took place. Rosalie's aghast expression as it morphed to one of disgust aimed at her brother. He watched as Nate's gaze turned to face them, looking as if he was a frightened animal, ready to bolt at a moment's notice. Nate figured it out. That 3 of the Cullen family, no, for including Emmett now, knew. Just how they figured it out, or how long they knew, he obviously didn't know, but it didn't change their knowledge. Both Edward and Nate had thought they were well guarded, and they were. Jasper could vaguely see the blonde trying to figure out where he went wrong. It seemed as if Edward's relationship with Nate was a mistake to him. Jasper figured that much out. A snapping of a twig in the woods nearby caught their attention, and they looked to see a large mass heading towards them. A flash of russet-colored fur and the smell of wet dog informed them of who it was. And boy did he look pissed. No one stopped the wolf, knowing that what he was about to do was well-deserved. Huge mistake, Edward, Jasper thought as his brother continued to walk in the opposite direction. Never turn your back on anyone. Hearing his siblings and Jasper's lingering thought, he turned around just as a huge mass slammed into his chest, knocking the wind from him. For once he was glad he couldn't breathe, because he knew he'd be hard-pressed to get another lungful after that hit. Edward's body seemed to collapse around the hit, and he was flung backwards into the one of the trees behind him, snapping it in half. Panting slightly, Jacob walked back over to Nate, nudging his large muzzle against the blonde's limp hand and whining when he reached his friend. Nate was still shaking lightly and nodded before heading back over to his vehicle, while Jacob shifted behind a few bushes and pulled on a pair of black sweatpants. Alice was the first to reach Edward, still shocked by the sudden attack. That was just a warning, Cullen. Next time you won't be so lucky, Jacob stated, and joined Nate in the car before it took off. Are you all right? Alice asked as the others joined them, and she grabbed Edward's hand to pull him up. Yeah, man. You were hit pretty hard, Emmett added in, and watched as Edward pulled off his jacket and undid a few shirt buttons. He pulled it open, and immediately a white object hit the ground below them. Rosalie bent down to grab the baseball and held it up. The ball seemed to be glowing with a light iridescent blue, and the smell burned their noses. That was what knocked the wind out of me, Edward wheezed, finally getting his voice back. All the vampires shared a look of confusion. Nate winced as Jacob slammed the car door closed once they reached their destination, and as he growled obscenities under his breath. Thank you, he whispered, and Jacob gave him a stern look. What are you? The question was blunt and to the point, and Nate cringed at the what, not who. If I wasn't quick enough, the prick would have figured out you threw the ball, and, no offense, but no human should be able to land such a hit on vampires, no matter how gifted they are. So I ask again. What are you? Don't interrupt me and I'll tell you. Just keep an open mind about what I tell you. Jacob sighed at the answer but agreed, fine. You haven't given any of us a reason to distrust you, so I'll listen. Thank you. Let's take this indoors. It's not something I should speak about in the open. And flashback. So, Nate had told Jacob part of his life. Of course, he omitted certain details, but the wolf was now the one person in Nate's life that knew what he was capable of doing. There had been doubt at first, but when Nate pulled out various pictures, old newspaper clippings, and created a henge no jutsu to alter his image into Sam, Quill, and then Embry Jacob's doubt nearly flew out the window. Nate told him about the shinobi nation, of the Hokages, about the rivalries and allies between the villages, and about his own position with the Leaf Village, how he was and always would be a soldier first, and a person second. Jacob didn't even blink when Nate's parents walked into the room, but observed them with a keen look, to which Nate chuckled and dismissed one. The entire room filled with smoke as his father disappeared. The look on Jacob's face had been priceless. Chapter 11, Sell Your Soul. A cacophony of scribbles permeated the air as Mr. Binns, the science teacher, continued to write different theorems on the board, but Nate could barely concentrate, and his gaze kept flitting to the orange leaves currently raining down from the sky. He could never concentrate worth a damn during this time of the year even as a child, and he would often make himself scarce by skipping during this time. He glanced at the board again, trying not to look at the date mocking him in the corner, but was unable not to. 8th of October. 2 more days, only 2. Tearing his eyes away from the date, he forced himself to focus on the constant monotone of the teacher. When am I ever going to use this? Nate thought as another theorem was added to the list, and to another glance at his watch. Oh crap. I'm going to be late if this keeps up. He heard a slight shifting behind him and internally sighed, knowing what was coming. Nate shifted his head to the left as yet another wad of paper was thrown at him, and kept his face perfectly neutral as it hit the teacher. That's it, Mr. Newton. Detention after school for 3 weeks. You'll be scraping the gum from the undersides of the table. The teacher hissed out, when he looked over Nate's shoulder, whose was gazing innocently at his pad, to see Mike's hand still outstretched. A look of horror crossed over his features. Fool, Nate thought sullenly and copied the next problem into his notebook before the bell rang. He quickly bolted from the classroom, making sure to send a furious Mike the thumbs up on his way out. He ran down the hallway, avoiding people left and right, apologizing loudly as he went, and the most of the students gave bemused expressions at the daily occurrence. Nate saw the back of a familiar head, a full 6 inches above most of the other students, and he pulled out a small envelope, thrusting it into the other's hands as he ran past, not stopping. Give that to your dad for me. He called out over his shoulder, and just about dove through the exit doors. Well, that was odd. Rosalie murmured as she glanced at the envelope in Emmett's hand. Is it me, or does he seem a bit jumpy lately? Emmett voiced. You don't think he's avoiding us, do you? No, Edwards apologized since then, and in all honesty I think we should just leave him alone. If he wanted us to know, he would have told us already. She reasoned and walked away, her heels hitting the linoleum of the school hallways in a staccato beat. Yeah, I guess you're... Emmett looked up to see his wife already gone. Talking to myself already. I blame Nate, he said in an exasperated manner, and went to join her. Edward watched as a blonde blur ran from the building at top speed, jumping over small bushes and hedges frantically as he bolted down the road. Nate hitched the strap of his backpack and turned a sharp corner, and then he was gone. A giggle to his right interrupted him. Follow him, Eddie. I want to see what he's been doing. At the voice, Edward whipped his gaze to the now occupied passenger seat. Alice, when did you? You must be really out of it. We've been here since you got in the car. Emmett's voice sounded from the back. Jasper's taking the other car home, so Rosie and I decided to join you on this little stalking trip. I'm not stalking him, Edward rebutted, and Alice rolled her eyes. Of course not, but I still want to see what he's been up to. I haven't gotten any visions from him lately, and it's been driving me insane. Well, I still say we should just leave him to his business and go home. Rosalie gave Emmett a scathing look. I still can't believe you dragged me here. Oh, right. Like you're not curious too? He teased, and she shook her head in exasperation, used to her husband's antics. Of course I am, but I'm still not going to invade his privacy. All right, so let's say we just happen to swing by on our way home from school. Any objections? The car stayed silent and Emmett whooped. Let's get rolling, Jeeves. Start the car. Fine, but we're not staying. Edward relented, his curiosity finally getting the best of him, and pulled out of the parking lot. Damn it, Ted. Watch where you're swinging that fucking pole. A gruff-sounding man yelled as the Cullens drove up to an area where most men wore an orange hard hat. It had taken a while to find Nate because he took all the back roads and jumped over fences to get his destination. Rosalie, no matter how curious, had hissed at Emmett's recommendation to just ram through. There was no way she was going to let them scratch, much less dent the car. The scent they followed had stopped about 8 miles out of town, near a small iron factory that was abandoned in the late 1920s. Or what was left of it. A man, most likely a newbie, who had been transporting a long wooden beam, perpendicular to his shoulders, quickly turned in the direction of the voice, taking the beam with him. Men nearby ducked as the beam sailed over their heads. "Do I have to do everything myself?" The gruff man from before bellowed. "Now, Nate, help the fool." A man that had been shoveling in a nearby ditch glanced up and nodded, piercing his shovel into the ground. Nate walked up clad in large worn jeans held up by a belt as it hung precariously off lean hips. Work boots covered in mud, an orange hard hat atop his head, and no shirt. His blonde hair was pulled back and hidden beneath a black bandana that stuck out from the back of the hat, and his tan skin had a light sheen to it from the perspiration. It was painfully obvious he worked out, from the light definition of his sculpted abs down to his toned arms and legs. He was not by any means built like Emmett was, but he did have the lithe body of a swimmer or a dancer, one built for swift reactions and survival, not show. Edward gulped at the sight, now wishing he was anywhere but here. "Sure thing, sir," Nate said, and grabbed the back end, before the man could harm anyone. Alice whistled. My. Who knew he was hiding that underneath all those clothes he insists on wearing?" Both Nate and the other man placed the beam onto a pile of others, and Nate waved as the man left, and then turned to look at the ostentatious car parked next to the other older models. "Dude, I think we were caught," Emmett said as Edward started to drive out of the area. He looked back through the trail of dust behind them to see the blonde just as he gave them the finger. "Oh yeah, we were definitely caught. Damn vampires. I thought they were supposed to be masters of stealth." Nate snorted. "Like hell they are." He ranted, thinking back to the earlier incident. Why it didn't cross their minds to just ask what I was doing, I'll never know. The road was quiet tonight, Nate mused as he walked alongside the pavement back towards Forks. The job had ended at 7, and judging from his watch, only half an hour had passed since he left. He sighed. It felt like he was always in a rush these days, as weeks seemed to pass by like the very cars on this road. Well, he was going to take his time heading home today. "My Cammy. I'm going to be 18 in a few days. 18 years. Only 18 years." To him they seemed like an eternity, but now? Life seemed to dull without his usual barrage of missions the council sent him on. Even with the vampires and shifters. Homesick. The word never meant anything to him before, except for being words on a page. It was different. Even though he loathed the idea of being anywhere near that pathetic excuse for a village, he still missed it. His friends, the people who were like family to him. In a sense he was alone out here because as far as he knew, there weren't any other ninja outside of the ninja nations. Hell, it wasn't like he could walk up to someone and ask. That'd land him in padded room faster than he could say QB. He hitched his backpack further up his shoulder, watching as twin lights lit up the forest ahead of him. Nate halted mid-step as those lights came into his view. It was strange. He watched as the lights lit up his form and beyond him, but he was caught, completely transfixed. His vision wavered and the lights seemed to morph into 4, then 6. The ground beneath him suddenly felt much farther down, and he stumbled slightly from the dizzying effect. "Sit. I need to sit," he rasped out, falling forward slightly and feeling the rough texture of gravel dig into his palm. It might as well have been 100 needles as far as his sensitive skin was concerned, and he moaned as his head started to pound. When his senses came back to him, it was like blinking. One moment he was on the ground, staggering around like a drunken man, and the next he was standing, perfectly erect, as if the entire ordeal had never taken place. He blinked, trying to clear his head of the lingering fuzzy effects. Taking in his surrounding, he noticed his bag was not at his side where he thought he left it. Instead it was 10 feet behind him. When had he dropped it? Nate shook as a forceful wind swept past him, ruffling his hair and jacket. What the hell had just happened? Nate knew he slammed the front door shut harder than necessary, as he bolted through, and slung his bag onto the black couch. He had run the distance back after the incident, not wanting to experience another, and be left in such a vulnerable position again. "Shit!" He hissed and ran a hand through his hair despairingly. The action had been a nervous habit of his. One he had thought he had broken, but apparently it was back full force, letting out an almost keening whine as he realized what he did and looked up at the clock, but did a double take. 12:56. No, 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 it can't be. That would mean I was out there for over 5 hours. His breathing came in harsh gasps and he willed himself to calm down, focusing on slowing his breathing before he passed out. Maybe he was sick. He could just have a case of the flu, knowing that a few students were out because of it this week. It would make sense that he caught it from them. Oh, who the hell am I kidding? I've never been sick a day in my life. A constant clattering noise from the kitchen caught his attention, and he relaxed once he saw his silver and black-colored phone vibrating across the countertop. All right, Nate, this is not the time to be panicking. He moved towards the phone and picked it up, looking at the caller. See, Cullen. Well, I did say he could call me night or day. It must be important for him to be calling this late, thought. The phone flipped open with just the slightest of pressure, but just as he was about to press the green button and answer, his vision developed a blackish tinge to its edges. Oh, fuck. Not again. The phone clattered to the ground as Nate's body slumped backwards and he unceremoniously hit the floor, blue eyes slightly open, but his gaze unseeing. Nate was consumed by the darkness swamping his vision. 15 minutes earlier, Carlyle glanced over a few medical documents across the desk in his study, making sure to memorize the symptoms of each ailment, and think of what regimens he should have his patients follow. He couldn't help but sigh when he found his mind wandering back to the envelope given to him from Emmett. It had been a brief note from the Wolves and what they heard from their allies in Italy. Apparently they were all on edge about a few suspicious-looking human characters that entered Volturi grounds and requested a meeting, claiming sanctuary. Once the visitors had left, unharmed, the Volturi had begun to move their squads into various positions of easy to defend and attack from, pushing the small shifter pack further into their own territory than they already were. The suspicious movements and actions worried all of them. Just what could they be planning? I need to speak to Nate. He murmured and pulled out the slip of paper with the blonde cell number that had taken up permanent residence on his person, in one form or another, and dialed the number on his desk phone. A few moments of ringing later and Nate's voice came on the phone. Hey. Oh, good nah. Carlyle stopped abruptly when the voice continued, meaning he got the answering machine. I'm obviously not at the phone right now, so just leave me a message at the beep and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Unless you're a solicitor, then you can take your phone and shove it up your... The phone beeped, and Carlyle had a hard time keeping a straight face. Hello, Nate. This is Carlyle. I just read your message and I must say this worries me. It would be great if you could join me in my home office for a reevaluation of the Volturi, and what we should do in the meantime. Just call me back on my home phone. He placed the phone back into its cradle. If the sinking feeling currently making itself home in his stomach was any indication, the Volturi were going to become a handful. A groan echoed from the floor in the kitchen, and a few minutes later a slight shifting followed. Why is that damn clock so loud? The thought rang out in Nate's head and he rubbed his temples, trying to dissuade the sound. Suddenly he stopped, realizing he was feeling the cold, hard surface of tile beneath him and not the softness of his bed. Wait! His gaze snapped open in surprise and only barely recognized the familiar white pastel ceiling above him. The very ceiling he himself often scaled to check, set, and reset motion sensor traps he designed himself. Where am I? Slowly, he pulled himself off the floor, using the counter edges as support, and checking his surroundings in a motion that was so ingrained he didn't even notice as he took inventory of the doors, windows, and areas large enough for him to sufficiently cover himself, escape routes and hiding places. Kitchen, but what was I doing? Was I attacked? A flash of silver on the counter triggered a déjà vu moment, and he realized what he had been doing before he fell had been important, but couldn't pull the memory forth from the recess of his mind. Phone, I was checking my phone and then I blacked out? But what was I doing before? He grabbed the thin cell and looked at the display screen, hoping to possibly renew the vacant gaps in his memory. One missed call, C. Cullen. Suddenly, the memories rushed back with such a force it nearly had him back on the floor. Only his tight grip on the counter kept him standing. Riven, you're working the ditch shift today, a large man holding a clipboard called out over the crowd of other workers. The sun was out that day, which might as well have been a supernatural occurrence in the town of Forks. It was also warm enough to work without a shirt, and hopefully regain that tan he had in Konoha. Without it he looked a little sickly. The pale complexion that Bella had was something he would never be able to pull off to the extent that she had. The Cullen children also showed up. They had been following him from the school grounds, their curiosity finally getting the better of them. He was able to feel their presence and careened through alleys and ambled over fences, just to toy with them a bit. If they wanted to find out what he was up to, they would have to work for it. Then by the time he knew it, his shift was over and he was heading home. He walked along the familiar curvy road path, and that was when the first symptoms started. That can't be good," he murmured, as he remembered how he zoned out the previous night after becoming entranced by the dancing headlights. Nate reached for the pad and pencil nearby, usually reserved for his shopping list. "All right, I need to start off slow. What symptoms did I have last night, and when I woke up?" After a few minutes he looked back down at his continually growing list. Fainting, dizzy, swooning, distortion of reality, shaking, slight, tired, confusion, memory loss, amnesia, headache. Wait a minute. I was feeling off even a few months ago. This has been going on far longer than I thought, he said as he recalled how he had behaved in his past and recent confrontations. Weak, pain, throbbing of the limbs, shortness of breath, paranoid, easily angered. The other symptoms had started off slow, he realized, and built up gradually over time. It would explain why he wasn't able to notice it until now. Weak, his fist colliding with a boulder during training and drawing blood from a minor abrasion that in the past wouldn't have any sort of effect, or if it did would heal over in a matter of seconds. That's another thing, he scribbled again on the sheet. Slower healing, pain, shortness of breath, and throbbing limbs could all be categorized in the same area. These days he would easily become sore and tired during the simplest of tasks. His previous stamina had taken a hit too. He would be breathing hard after running 10 miles when he used to run 20, and even 30 if he was feeling up to it. His strength seemed to be diminishing as well. When he lifted heavy items he was often left with an almost empty, throbbing feeling in his limbs. As if the bone all but disappeared. Easily angered. How he nearly attacked Edward in the music store, thinking it was someone trying to catch him off guard to kill him. He could clearly remember wanting to snap the neck of the impersonator, wanting to watch the man writhe on the ground, trying to breathe through the blood invading his lungs. Nate wanted to see the man die in a pool of his own blood for even thinking of toying with him in such a way. His entire body still just as the ending tale of that last thought winded through his head, slightly horrified with himself. When had he ever wanted to witness such a thing? Even when something like that was required of him during a mission, he always made sure to make his enemy's death swift. But now it was almost as if he didn't care for human mortality. His thoughts were becoming almost sadistic, cold-blooded, and evil. His body shivered on its own accord at the thought, and he brought the pencil in his hand back down to the paper. Bloodthirsty. I need to research this some more. Maybe the medical book Tsunade left can shed a little light on this. But I need to deal with Carlisle first. Oh shit, today's Thursday. I was planning on calling in sick tomorrow. He bit his lower lip in thought. If he called in sick it would explain his absence today as well. Alright, that sounds good. Now to call Carlisle. Carlisle Cullen looked over the note from Nate again and back to the piles of books he retrieved from his vast library. He had read and reread the description Nate had left him in the letter about the Volturi's guests, and each time he couldn't shake the feeling of recognition. The two smallest of the three had been clad in dark brown cloaks for most of the journey until they divested them at the entrance. According to the letter their appearance was reminiscent of old men, with their frail, bent-over bodies, loose, folded skin and bald head. Nothing that was too odd. It wasn't until both simultaneously looked up into the patch of trees to their observers did they see that something was severely wrong with their first assessment. It was the eyes, an almost caramel color that darkened to black and bled into the whites of their eyes, consuming it completely. They didn't have the characteristics of a vampire nor of any wolf, and they obviously weren't human. But what in the world did that leave? The third was the largest of the trio, being around 6'5", and he too wore a dark cloak. When asked to show themselves, he raised a hand to the others and they immediately followed the silent order. From this one action it was clear who the leader was. He didn't do anything odd until after the meeting, when all three of the head of the Volturi, Ero, Caius and Maris escorted them to the door. When the group was all set to go, their cloaks back on and their packs handed back to them, a rookie vampire made a mistake, and if the guests didn't react the others would have. Being new, he was far stronger than his sire, and the others more experienced than he was. He pushed his luck when he spoke of the guests when their backs were turned, and it was with that disobedience that his life ended. The large man didn't even spare him a glance as what was seemingly his belt unraveled from his waist and dropped to the floor, the sun's rays glinting almost ominously off the steel coating it had. It wasn't until it was completely unraveled that the wolves realized his belt was attached to the base of his spine and a large, black stinger was at the end. The newly discovered tail, around 3 inches in diameter, laid itself in coils on the ground, looking around 9 feet long, and when the vampire turned away it lunged with incredible speed to wrap around the man's torso. The stinger plunged itself into vampire chest cavity and forced its way in deeper, before quickly retracting and once again and stabbing deep into his forehead. The vampire crumpled into a heap at the man's feet, and the tail retracted. The others who escorted the trio the rest of the way out never said a word after that. Carlyle sighed as he finished leafing through another book, still unable to find what he was looking for. If only he could remember exactly where he read about them. He let his head fall into the palms of his hands and thought. It was in a book of mythology as well as religion, he knew that, but most of the books he had were falling apart. Some were thrown when they became too deteriorated to read anymore, and in this weather it happened more often than he would like. He prayed the book he was looking for was not one of them. I wonder if it's in the attic, he said out loud, thinking to all the books he and his wife wrapped to protect them from the moisture. Only the oldest books were placed into the trunk upstairs, and it would explain why he wasn't able to find it among the other books. He quickly made his way up into the dusty room, and finding the maroon trunk wedged between Edward's old records and the family's outdated clothes they couldn't bear to part with just yet. A thick layer of dust slid from the lid when he lifted it open to sift through the contents inside. After a few minutes his hand came into contact with a thick book, and upon unwrapping it saw the title and the author's name, Dante's Inferno. Dante Alighieri? Sighing to himself in relief, he brought it back to his office and began to carefully turn the pages of the musty book. He was a few paragraphs into Canto 17 when he found what he was looking for, and before he could leave another message on Nate's cell his wife appeared in the doorway. "Carlyle," she said, "Nate just called. He wanted me to say he got your message, but he needs a couple of days off for familial reasons and left us the number for Jacob's cell phone." "All right, thank you, Esme." He gratefully accepted the number and dialed it before he did anything else. "Yeah?" The voice was whispered on the other line, and Carlyle knew he was taking a risk doing this while school was still in session, but unfortunately this couldn't wait. "Hello, Jacob. I'm sorry for calling while you're in class, but I needed to set up a meeting between you and I. It has to do with the Volturi and what possible actions we could take. That, and I think I may know what they're meeting, if the description Nate gave me is anything to go by." He rattled off quickly, but slow enough for the wolf to understand. "Seriously? All right, I can fake a seizure or something and be over in a little bit. Hang tight." The line went dead and Carlyle placed the phone back in its cradle. He looked back at the open book on his desk, the illustration filling up one of the 2 visible pages. The intricacy was certainly something. The works of today just didn't have the same feel to them these old works had. It was there in its small cross-hatchings and subtle shading. It was the text about the creature, though, that had his full interest. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll be sure to let you know about my dad's condition," Jacob said with as much weariness in his voice he could muster, and nearly cringed at the sympathetic look on his teacher's face. He hated lying like this, but sometimes he had no choice. After Carlyle called, he ended up calling his father during his bathroom break, and together they came up with a story that would allow him to leave campus for an undeterminable amount of time, leaving it open-ended enough to allow for leeway if needed. As it was, the story they told was that Billy needed to go in for some surgery. Jacob expressed that he would like to be nearby if his father needed anything. They conveniently left out whether it was minor or major surgery. "You take your time, dear. I'll send one of your friends with your homework, so don't worry about that. Drive safe now." "Of course, thank you." He stepped outside into the cold air and shed his jacket once he reached his car. It was too damn hot to be wearing the thing anyway. Putting it into gear, he pulled out of the parking space and started the journey to the Cullen home. No, even this doesn't sound right. There's got to be something else. Nate groaned as he crossed off another ailment from the books given to him by Tsunade. For the better half of the morning he worked his way through 2 books of possible poisonings and infections he could have contracted while being here, but nothing came up. At this rate I might as well just send a letter to Basan. At least then I'll more than likely get an answer within 2 months, he said, the statement dripping with sarcasm. He picked up the next book and cringed slightly at the title. What ailments should you know about as a ninja? What am I for now? He thought and cracked open the thin book regardless. Chapter 1. How to deal with fevers pass. Chapter 2. How to properly bandage and treat a wound, double pass. Let's see. Nothing. No, wait a minute. He brought a finger up to chapter 10, the second to last chapter in the entire book when the title caught his eye. Chapter 10. Chakra poisoning, what it is and how to deal with it. Well, it's worth a shot. He turned to the appropriate chapter and began reading the text. It only barely went over some of the symptoms, but as it was, he had all of them. He reached down and pulled up a medical dictionary, turning to chakra poisoning, and quickly read through the definition. Chakra poisoning, a condition brought on by excess chakra in one's system. It can be caused by multiple reasons, such as tied chakra lengths, or simply not expelling the chakra from one's system, though recent studies have led medical doctors to believe it might be passed down from family member to family member. It is not infectious like the flu or the cold. If the chakra is not expelled from the system, it could cause irreparable damage to the body, and eventually death. Tied chakra lengths must mean knotted lines that run the chakra throughout my body. It would certainly stop it from expelling all the way, I suppose. More intricate symptoms were listed at the bottom, and Nate mentally ticked them off in his mind as he went down the list. All of them. I have all of them. Mood swings, dizziness, dazes, it's all here. He thought and opened another book to look for possible treatment, besides just expelling his chakra. Only one thing was listed. If symptoms persist after deteriorated chakra is gone from the system, seek medical attention. Nate sighed. If this didn't work. No, this will work. I know it will. Nate closed his books and made his way out into the forest a good ways away from his home and sat down, crossing his legs. Well, here goes nothing. He brought his hands together and forced it from his body, seeing the familiar bluish tendrils whip around him. A car door slammed just outside of Carlisle's home, and he went to meet Jacob on the front deck, making sure to bring the book with him. All right, you said you knew what those things were in the letter? I've already guessed they're not vamps, shifters, or humans. So, let's hear what you've come up with, he said as he sat down on one of the patio chairs. Carlisle dropped the book onto the table in front of the wolf, skipped to Canto 17 and read about 9 paragraphs in. Jacob eyed the book and cracked it open, grimacing when he saw the words. I never did like reading stuff like this, could never figure out what they're saying. He chuckled. If there is something you don't understand, just ask me. I only want you to go over the description of the creature. Jacob nodded and read over the passage, growing tense at what he was reading. When he was done, he flipped back to the cover of the book and looked at Carlisle with apprehension. That book was written in the early 14th century and was first published in 1314. The one you are holding is translated into English, and I think it's the 9th or 10th time it's been republished. The vampire answered and looked at the book. I can assure you this is no joke. Hold up though. I think I remember hearing something about this book. Doesn't it like talk about hell and stuff? Yes, it speaks of hell, heaven and purgatory. I was going to tell this to you when both you and Nate were free, but I felt this was too important to wait. Carlisle said, and Jacob nodded. Of course, I'll leave him a text. You wouldn't happen to know of these familiar reasons of his, do you? If there's something I could do to help? The vampire asked, and Jacob looked nervous for a moment. Nah, I just think he needs some time off. The wolf answered, I really should head home now, but I'll swing by on Saturday when Nate's here, if that's all right? That sounds fine. Goodbye, Jacob. See ya. Nate gasped as the bluish tendrils suddenly retracted and he leaned back to lie on the ground, completely exhausted. My headache's gone, he noticed, and slowly got to his feet, testing his limbs experimentally. The first thing he noticed was how more energized he felt, It was as if he took his previous energy and multiplied it by tenfold. It worked. It really worked. Man, I haven't felt this great in months, he exclaimed and ran the length back to his home. The next day, Esme paced in her kitchen thinking back to the phone call from Nate. He really had a wonderful family, and she would hate to think anything ill happened to them. Esme? She heard from the living room and made her way there. Upon reaching it, she saw Emmett giving her a quizzical look, while everyone else feigned non-interest. You all right? You've been pacing for the past few hours, and that's not even mentioning how flighty you've been. She inwardly smiled to herself. She could always count on Emmett to be blunt. Rosalie discreetly sniffed the air that wafted behind her mother, as she was the closest to the door. Do I smell muffins? She asked, and Esme gave a small smile at being caught. Yes, I also made a batch of cookies and some lasagna as well. She conceded and flopped down into a nearby chair. I sort of thought I should bring something over to Nate and his family, you know, just to see if he's all right. Carlyle couldn't help but chuckle. That sounds great, Esme. I've been wanting to check up on him as well. Oh, me too, me too. Alice chirped from the couch and dragged Jasper to his feet. So, I suppose this is going to be one of those family things? Rosalie muttered and frowned. It's common courtesy to check up on neighbors and see if they need anything, Rosalie, Edward commented and placed a bookmark to mark a page in the book he was reading. It's the least we could do. Of course I know that, but dropping by unannounced? That seems rude to me. She muttered and grabbed the proffered container of cookies given to her by Esme. We'll only be a few minutes, Esme said and darted out the door. If you insist, Rosalie sighed and followed, along with the rest of the family. Nate downed the last of the bourbon he bought from a nearby store and chuckled when he remembered the store clerk didn't even card him with a simple henge, and he took on the appearance of a 30-year-old brown-haired, green-eyed man. The clerk didn't even know what hit him. I suppose that's the benefits of living in this clueless society. Hell, with all their technological advances, you'd think they'd be able to pick up on the vampires and shifters. Then again, I'm probably expecting too much of them. He hiccuped and placed the rather large empty bottle onto the bare table with a clatter. He had purchased the second to largest bottle on the shelf, knowing he would need something strong to feel any of the effects. That, along with one of the bottles of sake Jiraiya stashed in his bag, was sure to keep him under the influence. Even a few hours would be a reprieve. He poured the liquid into a small dish and brought it to his mouth just as the doorbell went off. Swallowing it and placing it back onto the table, he rose carefully and ambled towards the door, careful not to break anything in his home along the way. Wonder who that could be, he said, and swayed for a moment before placing a hand onto the door knob to steady himself. The door opened and his bleary gaze looked out. There, standing in his doorway, was none other than the Cullens. Dude, you think he's been crying? Emmett asked when Nate opened the door, and Rosalie jabbed her elbow into his ribs. Kumbanwa, Nanika Ada? Nate said, and most of the Cullens looked at each other in confusion. Huh! Emmett responded, voicing everyone's thoughts. Dukashita no. Nate gave them a confused look, and Edward stepped up, recognizing the sound of the language Nate was speaking. Nate, you're speaking in Japanese? We can't understand you. The blonde nodded and replied, Gomanasai. His brow furrowed in thought, and the other sighed in relief when he spoke again. Sorry, sometimes it's difficult to keep from slipping back, he replied, his voice still heavily accented. Can we come in, Nate? We brought food for everyone. Alice broke the silence with her question, and Nate wasn't quick enough to hide a wince. Nate, you guys sure know how to time something just right, don't you? He murmured. Sure, I'll be right back. The family watched as he nearly collided with a nearby end table on his way into the living room, and kept their gaze on him to make sure he wouldn't collapse when, as he walked to the living room, the family glanced at the bare walls, and Edward was able to pick up on a thin wire stretching along the underside of one of the upper windows. Is there a reason why there's no family pictures or paintings at all in this place? Emmett asked as he looked down one of the hallways. I see what you mean. It's almost like he's the only one who lives here. Emmett, get back here! Rosalie hissed when she saw him opening random doors and looking into the rooms. There's nothing in these rooms. Esme, didn't you say the bedrooms were on the first floor? He asked instead, and she gave a brisk nod. Only one of them is occupied and Nate's scent is all through it. The other two, though? There's nothing but a few boxes here and there. Emmett walked back to the living room in case Nate went looking for them and saw the blonde come out from the kitchen, staggering slightly. You're drunk? Emmett declared as he realized why Nate was acting so funny, and Nate raised a brow. He threw an emptied bourbon bottle into the kitchen trash and returned as the rest of the family sat down, an inquisitive look on their features. The blonde didn't answer, but merely gave a shrug of the shoulders and sat down on the couch, pouring a spicy-smelling liquid from a white bottle with congee. He leaned back and sipped from the dish, eyes closed, savoring the flavor on his tongue. Nate, you do know the drinking laws in this country state you have to be of 21 years of age to drink, don't you? Carlyle asked, eyeing the large white bottle he saw Nate pour the liquid from. Seriously? Well, that explains why the clerk at the first store threw me out. I had to disguise myself to get the bourbon at the other, but the sake was a gift, Nate said offhandedly, and seemed to take another deliberate sip. Sorry, but I've been drinking on this particular day since I was 13. It's the one day I get drunk off my rocker, and it's sort of a tradition. Please don't tell Chief Swan on me. Nate begged in a falsetto voice, and Emmett laughed. Nate watched the room spin some more before they answered, and everything seemed to have slowed, and he knew he wasn't going to be able to get back up. Instead, he lay down on the two-seater couch he was on, his head resting on one end and his calves supported up by the other. His arm was thrown over his eyes in an attempt to block out the light, most likely. But surely your parents don't allow this? Do they even know? Esme uttered, horrified to think they would let their young son to do something like this. Nah, I doubt they would have cared anyway, Nate said, the words already gone from his mouth before he could retract them. Well, damn, must be the liquor, he thought, and glanced at Esme's shocked face, wondering what he was going to say now. I'm drunk. It's not safe to listen to what I say at the moment, he decided. What did you mean by would have? Why the past tense? Esme asked and waited for an answer. When none came, she noticed Nate's breathing had evened out. He was asleep. Well, that certainly was rude. Rosalie muttered and crossed her arms, while Jasper's eyes widened slightly. He's in so much pain, Rosalie, he murmured, and the family gave sympathetic looks to the blonde on the couch. But it runs too deep for me to pick up on the cause. That's so. Wait, where's Emmett? Alice asked, and she looked around for her lug of a brother, realizing that at some point he had vacated the room. Emmett looked over the locked door again. To break it down or not to break it down, that certainly was the question. It would leave too many marks, but then again the suspense was killing him. He grabbed the door knob and jiggled it again, and chuckled in an almost perverse manner as a thought came to his mind. He used his fingernails and placed them under the hinges, pulling them from the wall. Before long he was able to just lift the door away from wall, and allowed inside. The room was a study. High ceilings, pure white walls, and rows of books cases, some in languages he only saw on anime shows advertised on the television these days, and he couldn't understand a lick of it. However, he was able to notice some of the books for what they were. The anatomy books and plant books were the most obvious ones, as were the medical ones. I never pegged that one as a bookworm, he said in a thoughtful tone. He leaned further into the room, and the wall to the left caught his attention. It was filled with multiple photographs, and the grin on his face suddenly became devious. Bingo. Emmett, what the hell are you doing? He heard the sentence hissed, and looked up to see his wife as well as the rest of the troop. Hey guys, he replied sheepishly. Oh, I'm just hanging around. I heard you trying to unlock this door. Did you ever think that it was locked for a reason? Rosalie went on. But Emmett had tuned her out, nodding only every once in a while, and when she was done speaking he said, I know, Rosie, but I found where he hid his pictures. Problem is I don't see any that has the description of his parents that Esme gave us. See? He pointed his finger to the nearby wall. I'd say he's about 12 or 13 when he's wearing that orange jumpsuit-looking thing. Man, Alice would maul him in a second if she saw him wearing that thing. In the ones where he's wearing a more toned-down orange and black, I'd say he's around 15 or 16. The family moved closer to see the pictures Emmett was pointing at. Wow, he looks really young in these pictures, Alice said, and tried not to wince at the jumpsuit Emmett pointed out. That thing should be demoted to dish rag, she thought. Edward glanced over them, feeling a sense of longing wash through him. It had been so long since he had seen Naruto like this, so carefree. There were multiple pictures where the blonde was grinning like a loon and making faces at the camera as his friends either laughed or groaned in the background. Hey! Emmett laughed and pulled small frame from the wall. Check out this one. Edward stared at the photo for a moment, and couldn't help the grin that spread across his face. There was Nate, in a blue pajama set, the top half of his face wrapped in bandages and a large pad taped to his right cheek. One thing was for sure, he had to have been sleeping to have pulled that look off, what with his mouth wide open, drool collecting in the corner of his lips and his head tilted back. There was a very attractive woman with long dark hair that was kissing his left cheek with a soft, almost loving caress. The photo was also signed in both English and Japanese. Naruto Uzumaki, never give up on becoming Hokage. Fujike's Yuki. No way! He knows Yuki! Alice squealed at the thought. Oh, this is definitely her, she said as she looked over the picture. She's one of Japan's best actresses ever. I wonder who that is? Rosalie murmured as she looked at the next picture depicting an older Nate with his arm wrapped around the girl's shoulder, in a friendly way. She had to be about 5'1" with long blonde hair that reached to her waist, and striking pupil-less eyes a soft purple in color. She too was very beautiful. That would be the priestess Cheyenne. A voice called from the doorway and everyone turned to face the man that was able to sneak up on them. She's how I knew about your abilities, Alice. Her head whipped so fast in Nate's direction he could have swore her head snapped off. Please explain? She whimpered and stuck out her bottom lip before he could blink. The pout, it's that damn pout. He growled in his mind, already feeling a twitch coming on. That so has to be cheating. Her eyes seemed to have watered. Fine, she has an ability remarkably like yours. Only she's able to predict someone's death, which is, I guess, sort of seeing into the future. That is so cool. Alice chirped. How did you find out? A group of friends and I were hired by her and her followers. The second she saw me, she said that she saw my death occurring on this particular mission. Something about being taken out by some enemy, and then seeing my friends standing around my grave. He looked at the ground as if he was imagining such a thing. But, you're not dead. Emmett deadpanned and Nate nodded. How eloquently put, he muttered. For her entire life she predicted the deaths of those around her, and was never wrong. His eyes seemed to glow for a moment. As far as I'm concerned, if one more person tells me I've got to follow the script of some pre-written destiny, I'm going to snap. I told her I wasn't going to die, that I wasn't ready, and at first she laughed at me. Well, I guess I should have expected that if she was right for 17 years of her life. Suddenly he smirked, only I was the first to prove her that Uzumaki Naruto makes his own life. Sweetie, why isn't there any pictures of your father and mother? Esme asked as she looked over the wall once again, thinking she may have missed something. Nate seemed to close up again as his face became completely neutral. He stilled as he didn't seem to know what to say. I'm sorry. He finally settled on and looked away in an ashamed manner. Truth is, my parents have been dead since I was 3 hours old. Esme gasped and the entire room went silent at the revelation, and although Rosalie seemed sympathetic as well, but something else was on her mind. So you've been lying to us? More like, omitting the truth. The people posing as my parents were there merely for appearances. As it is, I'm supposed to kind of lie low. An emancipated minor draws too much attention, too much for my liking. I never meant to lie to you, Nate said, his voice bordering on a whisper. A clatter behind them brought their attention back to Edward, who stood there staring at Nate, the picture he had been looking at lying on the ground. I thought you had been adopted, he said. You knew? Rosalie asked. When we first met, he told my family and I he was an orphan, but never really delved further than that. Hearing Esme speak about Mr. and Mrs. Riven, I just assumed he had been adopted as we had. The room grew silent again and Nate sighed, running a hand through his already messy hair. I'm sorry you had to see my drinking habits and then hear that pitiful story, but I really need to be alone today. It's sort of day of mourning for me, you know? Of course, Nate, we're apologize for intruding. Carlyle spoke up and escorted his family back to the front of the house. Don't worry about it. I probably shouldn't be drinking like this anyway, but thank you. You came to see if I was all right, didn't you? The blonde suddenly asked. Emmett chuckled from the back of the group. That's what friends do, right? Nate smiled. Yeah, thanks for that. Surprisingly, you lot have managed to cheer me up, excluding Emmett of course. He retorted playfully, ignoring the indignant shout of hey from said vampire. I'll see you tomorrow, right? Of course, until then, Nate. Carlyle replied, and the family moved back to their respective vehicles. The next morning, Nate decided, had gone over far better than its predecessor. The constant pressure weighing down on him all that day had completely disappeared now that the impending doom that was his birthday had passed, and Nate could honestly say he couldn't be any happier. It even helped that today's weather mirrored his current mood, the sun currently peeking out from just the right amount of clouds and not a gray one in sight. Nope, today only white clouds littered the sky. So, with a slight spring to his movement, he easily threw the kunai in his hand towards the tree/assailant 50 feet away, the metal glinting dangerously in the sunlight just as it made a solid thunk, dead center in the imaginary bullseye. He heard a low whistle behind him and glanced back at his current visitor. You've got to spread your feet further apart for more balance, Seth. He called over his shoulder as he took out another kunai. Like this, was yelled back, and Nate took a glance back at his newly acquired student. Sometimes I wonder exactly how I get myself into these situations, he thought. Sometime during the week Seth had decided at least one of the pack should learn some of the things Nate was capable of. Even if it was only a little and feeling like an unneeded will at the moment, he opted to be just that. Approaching the blonde early the next morning, meaning this morning, Nate had awoken bleary-eyed from the lingering effects of the alcohol to find a semi-naked Seth on his porch. And upon blinking a few times to clear his vision and find he really wasn't hallucinating, invited him in. He quickly found the teenager was quite a fast learner, seeing barely any mistakes in the boy's form. Of course, what he was currently learning was only academy basics, and his rapidly changing body didn't allow for much flexibility at the moment, but he still was picking it up rather quickly. He walked over to him and saw Seth huff at the scrutinizing stare, wanting to rest the muscles he never thought he had most likely, and smack the snickering blonde. Nate ignored the glare and reached down to pivot Seth's left foot outward a bit more, ignoring the nearly pained squeak, and nodded. Good job, you had everything but that foot down. Hold it for a little longer so I can explain, he said once the wolf began to relax slightly. Now from this position it's easy to launch yourself forward into a run. Nate pressed slightly on the boy's lower back to get him to tip forward slightly, and Seth found that with his weight distributed it actually was easier. Or you could drop down into a leg sweep if the enemy is too close and catch them off guard. I get it. Yeah. That makes much more sense now. Seth chirped and sighed when Nate gave him a cold water bottle. Keep practicing that stance I taught you. I could see you were having some trouble contorting your body in the direction you wanted it to go. The only thing I could suggest would be stretching early in the morning to loosen up. Because most of what I was taught depends on the body performing a certain way, you know, to get the hell out of Dodge when needed. Nate said, and Seth snorted. Hey, there's nothing wrong with retreating to regroup. And that's the difference? Between running away and regrouping? Seth asked, knowing that either way he would feel like a coward. Yes, running away would be leaving your friends behind in battle, and that is the ultimate shame you could bring to your family and yourself. Hell, it might just be better to commit seppuku than having your comrades come after you. Nate mumbled, thinking of the once popular form of self-suicide. Sep what? Seth asked, completely bewildered. Nothing anyway. Retreating to regroup was something that is done when you are following orders of a commander? Just whoever is the leader of your group. Nate could see he hit a brick wall and knew he probably just confused the poor boy more. Alright, say you and your pack just caught wind of an unknown vampire in the area. I'm sure Sam and Jacob don't just send you on your way saying, fetch, right? No, Seth said dryly, but couldn't help the chuckle that escaped from him. Right, they'd make a plan first, designate a group leader, and then you take off. Seth nodded, so Nate continued, and if, on the off chance you get separated and there's a horde of vampires that you can't take on alone, then you retreat so 1, you don't die, and 2, hopefully you can get some backup. Understand? Seth nodded vigorously, and Nate stretched high up into the air. Alright, I've got to head over to the Cullens now, so I guess come back when you have what I showed you down to a T. I want you to be able to do that in your sleep. I'll work on it. Seth promised and went off into the woods behind the house to shift and head back home. Nate chuckled and took off in the opposite direction. Time to head to work. Ding dong, the bell went off and Esme went to answer it. Hey, I brought the containers back. The family heard from the living room, the tone being sheepish at best, and for a moment there was silence. Oh my, it's all gone. Did you store the rest? Esme asked as they entered the living room, and Nate's face brightened to a slight red as Jacob laughed from the couch. He eats nearly as much as I do. He crowed when confused glances were thrown his way and could feel Nate's glare on him near the end. Just because you decided to eat one more bacon slice than I did, just to spite me, might I add, does not mean you can beat me when it comes to food. The blonde pouted. Jacob just shrugged his shoulders and turned away, muttering, Keep telling yourself that, Blondie. Anyway, forget that. Just how long have you been here? I don't think I've ever seen you up this early unless it meant food, the blonde remarked, and nodded in understanding when Jacob held up a donut and some coffee. That explains it then, bribery in its truest form, he said and reached for an empty cup, smelling the coffee. Well, as they say, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Alice joined in and held up an empty glass in a mock cheer. Here, I'll drink to that. Nate crowed and did the same with his newly acquired beverage. However, I know I wasn't invited all for fun and games. Carlyle, you said you had some important information to share? The blonde's face went from cheery to serious in only a second, and although the Cullens were used to Nate's quick changes of attitudes, it was always a sight to see. Yes, I reviewed the letter with the descriptions of these newcomers, and I must say just reading about it made me nervous for several reasons. Everyone could hear Emmett snort in the background. I'm pretty sure the obvious ones don't need repeating, so I'll just go over what it is I found. Carlyle pulled the reading glasses from his shirt pocket and flipped to the marked pages. Canto 17. Nate fought to keep a glare off his face caused by the offending little book in Carlyle's grasp. According to the vampire, the main character, feeling as if he had taken the wrong path in life, decides to join the Roman poet, Virgil, on a journey through the circles of hell, purgatory, and paradise to find his way back to God. There are a total of 9 circles, each descending further and further into hell. Depending on the weight of your crime here on earth, you are set to one of these rings. Carlyle explained the contents of the book. The paragraph I just read on the beast Geryon, the guardian of the 8th circle of hell, resembles the description of the man described in the letters. And these pictures, Nate murmured, looking over the scans Carlyle made the other night. The work of demons. Can't say it surprises me, he thought and sighed, looking out of one of the glass walls the Cullen home sported and wondering where the hell his good mood ran off to, while the others talked among themselves. He slowed his breathing and tried not to reach over to shred the book, making sure to focus on the calm weather outside and the light breeze wafting through the trees. His eyes closed automatically for a few moments, and opened again to see the slight reflection of himself on the glass. Leaning up a little, he kept his gaze on it, and felt his breath hitch when his cerulean eyes flashed to red and the figure smirked before letting loose a low rumble that could be mistaken as purring. Nate's cerulean eyes narrowed. He knows something. Nate? He heard a voice sound from his left, effectively breaking him from his thoughts, and turned to face Jasper's curious gaze. Are you all right? I'm sensing a lot of hostility on your part, and contentment. Nate's eyes widened a fraction at the empath's thankfully whispered declaration, knowing that what he was feeling was certainly not contentment. Could he be picking up on QB? Just as he was about to speak, he was drowned out when Rosalie spoke up a split second before. Why, you can't be serious? Demons, Carlyle? Rosalie asked. Her astonishment at the conclusion made Nate sigh. You know, Rosalie's right. I mean, it's almost as unbelievable as vamps and shifters, wouldn't you say? Nate asked in a bored tone, completely ignoring Rosalie's hiss and placing the pictures back onto the table. Did you say there are 9 layers, Carlyle? Yes, only the last 3 have inner pockets for the damned. How lovely. May I see the book? Nate eased the book into his lap and shifted through the pages. I can probably get this book at the library and get more research done there. Man, even with this possibility, there's still not enough information as to what we're really dealing with here. And in all honesty, I don't think we're going to know until it's too late. Carlyle added, and Nate nodded. That is always how it works, huh? Nate agreed. Well, Jacob and I will relay this back and tell the others to keep an eye out. I think that's all we can do at this point. Nate sighed and leaned back further into the couch, catching Esme's glance at him. Knowing full well what was coming, he decided to just throw as much onto the table he was willing to at the moment. Better to let a little information go now than to have them drag it out completely, especially since he wasn't quite ready to admit every sob story of his life. You obviously want to ask me something, why not just come out with it? He started off, and she fiddled with the hem of her sleeve. She shook her head, but it was obvious enough for him to tell what she wanted to ask. He looked away from her, suddenly feeling uncomfortable, and twiddled with the plastic lining on the chair. Jacob, he noticed, had started to tap his foot in anticipation, and took another shaky sip of his coffee. Well, now or never, I suppose. My mother, he started slowly, died in childbirth. Dad skipped out on her when she told him she was pregnant with me. From what I was told by the caretakers at the orphanage, my mother was a whore and my dad a bum, he rattled off, looking almost bored to the others, as if they weren't speaking about people that were supposed to be loved ones. I never did believe them, though. They had a tendency to lie through their teeth, he said with a smile, which in another situation would have been charming, but here was bordering creepy. He doesn't care. Edward heard the phrase pass through nearly everyone's mind simultaneously as they heard Nate speak about his family in almost a flippant manner. After a long period of silence, no one knowing what the right thing to say would be, Esme spoke up. How are you financially, dear? Nate turned to give her a quizzical look. I know it must be difficult for a 17-year-old to afford a house like that, go to school, and have a job. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. Nate was thrown off kilter for a minute at the motherly feelings emanating from Esme, but made sure not to show it. I have enough money to survive and then some. You shouldn't worry yourself over something like that. I'm perfectly capable of fending for myself. I'm sure you are, Nate, but that doesn't stop me from worrying. No. I didn't think it would, he replied softly, and after a moment checked his watch. Wow, I've been here for a while. I really should be heading back. Got that project due on Monday, he explained, obviously a change in conversation and his cue to get out while he could. He rose from his seat. I'll see you guys Monday. Nate silently moved out into the parlor, and the only signal that alerted them to him leaving was the slight clicking of the door. Edward watched from his perch on one of the tree branches as Nate immediately made his way to the line of the woods and walked alongside it, an easy position to hide from view in only a split second if he needed it. Everything the blonde did confused the vampire, and for a moment, he wondered if he ever even knew Nate. Or if everything they shared so long ago was just a simple joke. He held back a sigh and continued to watch the blonde, feeling a vice-like grip around his unbeating heart the longer he did. Suddenly Nate stopped. You know, I really hope you have better things to do than stalking. Nate called out over his shoulder and turned to face him as he jumped from his perch to land softly and make his way out into view. Edward, as exciting this little role-play fetish you have going on as I'm going to have to decline. You see, I'm rather busy as it is. Nate rattled off, something he was prone to do as a way of distraction. Edward chuckled at the familiarity. You seem to have a habit of talking a lot when you're nervous, he stated, and the blonde stopped and tilted his head. It sure seems that way, huh? He said cryptically and with a small smile. So? What did you want? I was just hoping we could talk. Talk? All right, sure. So, how's your life been? Nate asked cheekily, and Edward sighed. Not that kind of talk. I heard Jasper, Nate. He briefly noted the fact that Nate's eyes seemed to darken a fraction. What did he mean when he said, I'm sensing a lot of hostility on your part, and contentment? He seemed almost confused. Nate gave him a look of pure confusion, and almost childlike innocence. You know, I'm not entirely sure? I just figured he was doing it for kicks. Edward's gaze narrowed, at the familiar look. You should know you can't trick me like the others, Nate. I know you a little too well, and I've seen that one too many times to know you only use it to cover something up. Now, what are you hiding? Well, damn. Nate scratched the back of his head and relaxed his posture, digging his hands deep into the recess of his pockets. You ever think that there might be something bigger out there? I mean something besides vampires and shifters? Edward seemed almost confused at the statement. Do you mean a higher power? Nate nodded slightly. Edward's human family had been religious, attending church when they could and so forth. But even he wondered what kind of God would damn his children to a life he and his new family had. Literature and old folklore called his kind evil, and what was worse, he believed it to a degree. Enough to know his soul was already tainted, and if ever did die he'd be heading straight down. He was pretty sure his relationship with Nate had sealed that deal long ago. But double damn him if he ever brought Bella with him. Yeah, I mean there has to be something that created this. Nate waved his hand to encompass everything before him. Everything that Carlyle quoted from that book seems like the delusions of a madman. Or at the very least a man on weed. Edward, had he been human, knew he would have choked at what normally should have been a joke. But it was the way Nate said it that showed he was serious. Obviously people have their own ideas. But if people can believe in a savior, does that mean there's evil just as great to sway you? Edward stilled. Nate did have a point. After all, everything in this world was about balance, and if there was such faith in the Bible, who's to say there isn't something completely evil countering it? Nate glanced at him and grinned suddenly. That charming grin that brought back so many memories. Despite whatever the hell you thinking, Edward, you're not damned. Startled out of his thoughts, Edward just sighed at the blonde's upbeat attitude. How would you know something like that? He questioned. Sometimes it was hard to believe he was the one with the mind-reading gift, what with the way Nate just seemed to know exactly what was on everyone's mind. Easy, it's because you care for others to the point of putting their welfare before your own. Nate chuckled. Just because your heart isn't beating, doesn't mean it's not there. As much as that meant to him, that Nate believed that it still didn't sway his doubts. A moment later he realized what Nate had done. What does this have to do with Jasper's earlier comment? Nate smirked. Absolutely nothing. I'm just trying to distract you until it's forgotten. Edward sighed and had the insane urge to pinch the bridge of his nose. Nate, I know you wouldn't ever hide anything that harms us, but I just need to know. How dangerous could this get? Nate looked at the copper-haired vampire, who was so obviously worried. Not only for his family, but for Bella as well, who could be asinine enough to just ignore that. But it was that look that also promised something else. And if it's as dangerous as what you're thinking? He questioned softly. Edward paused at the double meaning. Nate wanted to know what he was going to do if it was. I can't drag Bella into this. If this does become a problem. Sudden clarity grew in the blonde's eyes. Nate was really too smart for his own good. You do understand that leaving her like that would most likely break her, don't you? Nate asked, keeping his voice perfectly level. You want to protect her, then be there for her, because if you leave... Nate's blue eyes seemed to bleed into purple. I'll just have to find you and drag your ass back, and neither of us wants it to come to that. Edward just brushed aside the comment. It wasn't as if he didn't believe the blonde, it was just hard to believe something like that would occur. Don't get your panties in a twist, Cullen. I don't think this calls for such a drastic action yet. But if this does end up going the route I'm hoping it doesn't, we might all be screwed. Edward's eyes widened a fraction at the declaration. Don't waste what time you have with her. He put away the small knife still in his grip and began walking away. But he stopped just as Edward began to do the same. Oh, and Edward? The vampire stopped mid-stride to face the blonde. I was serious about what I said earlier, and if I have to, I'll break your legs and drag you back, kicking and screaming. Nate grinned in a way that promised just that and much more, before turning away. It was Nate's last comment, the one that was whispered and drowned out by the blustering breeze that stilled Edward. Besides, if anyone is damned to go to hell, it's me. Elsewhere, a quivering mass of robes laid in the middle of the room, beady black eyes peeking out from underneath the hood, chancing a glance at the feet of the figure on the throne before him, but no higher. To look higher would surely mean his death, for he was nowhere near worthy to gaze at royalty. It shook at a higher pace when he heard the telltale tapping of fingernails on the throne's armrest, conveying the promise of pain. Master. Please. The voice stuttered from the robe, and the thing allowed the hood to fall back. Small, black, beady eyes spaced far apart on the gray, oblong-shaped head blinked rapidly in fear. The immortals. Sharp red eyes shifted to glance at him, and he gulped. Have no information on what you seek. An eerie silence fell over the room, one that scared the strange being to no end. Suddenly it was filled again, with a deep, throaty chuckle of humor. Normally something like this could have been construed as good, but the rolling power pouring off the figure ensured it was far from it. Immortals? The figure on the throne questioned, before a full rumbling laugh followed. The room immediately silenced, and he could feel those red eyes fall upon him with disdain. Those things. The word was spat out at the same time the chandelier above them began to sway from the sheer power oozing out. Cling to farce immortality. They are nothing but insects not even worthy to lick my boots in the grand scheme of things, and soon. An almost maniacal grin filled the figure's features. Soon that little power trip thereon will be ripped from their cold, dead fingers. Yes, master, and you shall rise to show them the true meaning of immortality. The creature agreed and unfortunately drew his master's attention back to him. You, however. Black eyes looked back at him, are expendable. Horrible screeching reverberated off the walls and the sound of sloshing liquid hit the floor. Moments later the front doors opened and the guards that had been waiting outside walked inside, stopping at their master's command. The last to enter being a tall man with a silver belt wrapped multiple times around his lithe waist, and he too stopped, making sure to keep the blood on the floor off his boots. Find him, Geryon. Do not fail me. The figure enunciated the last 4 words carefully, with just enough scathing in the tone to show how much pain Geryon would be in should he. Of course not, Master Reisenball, he murmured and withdrew, making sure to keep his master in sight until he was out the door. Because if he were to turn his back, who knows what would become of him. Nate's pen tapped on his notebook as the teacher drawled on. The weekend, he realized, had passed by far too fast, and once again his butt was glued to his desk chair as he constantly dodged paper wads from the brat 3 rows back. How the hell had he landed himself in this situation again? Nate, are you all right? He heard the feminine voice from behind him, but didn't turn because the teacher's eyes landed on him. Oh, yeah? That, he thought idly and minutely turned his head to address the person. I'm fine, Jessica. Just trying to decide whether I should take Mike's little gifts. I've been leaving him up a notch. He chuckled when he saw her eyes widen a fraction. That was you! She whispered in astonishment, and blushed at the attention it drew to her, but Nate seemed unperturbed. Of course, you really think these squirts can hold up to my prowess? He gestured to the people in front of him. I had to rig that trash can just right to get it to spill its contents on him as he walked in the alley behind the school. Jessica giggled when he rubbed his nails on his shirt, buffing them. And if you thought that was great, just wait for a few. A few what? She asked, and the intercom sounded. Mike Newton, please report to the principal's office. Nate, what did you do? She tried, with difficulty, to keep her tone reprimanding. Meet the Fox in 2 minutes in the parking lot. He turned to give her a conspiratorially look. You won't be contacted again. He faced the front again, a grin decorating his face, and if Jessica learned anything about Nate, that grin he was sporting meant trouble was on the way. And that class ends our time on logarithms. Please note there might be a quiz on tomorrow, or there might not be. Sleep in fear tonight. The bell rang a few moments later and both bolted out and made their way through the growing crowd in the parking lot, Nate snickering the whole way. Oh my God. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth as she took in the state of Mike's truck. The dark blue color of the truck was barely showing through the gobs of silly string, toilet paper, and colored foam covering the entire truck. The truck was also covered in sparkles, and one of the students looked in the back, exclaiming, "There's marshmallows back here." What really topped it all off, though, was the poster-sized picture apparently super-glued onto the front windshield. A picture depicting Mike in a very comprising position with one of his football teammates. Nate snickered. Of course the picture was doctored, but a bunch of backwoods kids wouldn't know that. And my truck. Mike sounded from behind and Nate whistled. Hey, not bad, Mikey. A little odd, but hey, whatever floats your boat. Mike Newton glared at the blonde and Nate could faintly see the wheels and gears turning behind the boy's eyes, no doubt wondering when Nate had the time to do this. Ah, the joy of shadow clones. Edward sat with his siblings at their usual cafeteria table during one of the rare free times when they were all together, speaking low enough so others didn't pick up on what was said. So, let me get this straight. You tailed Nate to ask him a question, and when you caught up with him the two of you had this deep philosophical discussion, completely forgetting about the question, and by the time you realized he was already gone. Emmett asked, his voice laced with disbelief. He outsmarted you? Loud guffaws followed that completely broke the quiet atmosphere, and Emmett doubled over at the thought. Students nearby used this as a chance to look at the mysterious Cullens, and Rosalie glared at her husband. You are drawing unwanted attention, you oaf. Be quiet. Let em look rosy. They know perfection when they see it. He whispered conspiratorially behind his hand and leaned away, propping his feet up onto the cafeteria table. Ah, that kid knows just the thing to crack me up. He did not outsmart me, Edward denied, resisting the urge to hit his brother, and although he did evade the question, he did reassure me that we have nothing to worry about, as of yet. As of yet? Just what does he think is coming? Jasper spoke up from his corner of the table. Edward sighed and shifted in chair slightly to relieve pressure, realizing he had yet to do so in over an hour. He doesn't know, but he seemed to have an idea of some sort. Great. Just great, is it me? Or does it seem like ever since Nate showed up these odd occurrences have multiplied like vermin? Rosalie asked in exasperation. That may be true, but Carlyle has made it clear this would have happened either way. Jasper spoke up. I for one am glad he's on our side. He looked down at the table, clearly remembering the strange scented bursts of power that sometimes emanated from the blonde. Even I would hate to be that boy's enemy. Edward heard from his brother's mind, and his eyes widened at Jasper's deduction. Have I really been that unobservant? He couldn't help but question as he thought back to the blonde, but each time he saw the person he always knew. The funny, sarcastic, sweet, caring, confident, somewhat brash, incredibly trustworthy person, that in all honesty was probably the only one whose actions truly suited his mop of sunny bright blonde hair and cerulean eyes. Ward? His attention was brought back to the current conversation by Jasper, and he noticed Emmett's large calloused hand waving in front of him. And he's back, folks. Emmett grinned, and suddenly his smile turned almost lecherous. So, what were you thinking about, huh? Edward sighed and glared pointedly at him. Nothing along that line of thought. He deadpanned and looked back at Jasper, gesturing for him to continue. Your emotions were all over the place. Are you sure you're all right? Jasper questioned, concerned, and Edward immediately felt bad for worrying him. Yes, I'm fine. It's just that I've heard nearly all of you at one point in time comment about how it's good Nate is fighting with us and not against us. And although he shows amazing skill for a human, I'm having a hard time believing he is as big a threat as you're making him out to be. He conceded, and Jasper nodded in understanding. I think I understand, but you must understand that you have a preconceived notion of him already, knowing him from the relationship the two of you shared, one that was more than likely based only on the information he was willing to part with. Edward's eyes snapped back to the now interesting grooves in the table, seeing each individual ridge carved out by a sharp instrument. It's just, I didn't think you would ever lie to me. Jasper chuckled and leaned over to pat his brother on the back in a show of companionship, before replying, I never said he lied to you, Edward. I only meant that with the possible training he had, he probably didn't share every story with you in fear of chasing you off. Even I, in my entire human life, have never tried to speak to those who weren't in the war. It was just something they wouldn't understand because they were never there. Rosalie sighed. You're worried for the little human. She stated in her usual blunt manner, and not just him but Bella as well. It's perfectly all right. I mean, it is one of the reasons we've tried to avoid them all these years. Sweetie? Maybe now's not the Emmett started, but halted when his wife held up her hand. No, let me finish. We avoid them because of how fragile they really are. Because they would more than likely fear us when all we're trying to do is live. She looked Edward right in the eye, making sure he saw just how serious she was. But then we met Bella, and no matter how hard we tried to shake her, how much I despised her, she clung on like a damn leech. Edward realized he had growled at the comparison, and saw Emmett nervously tapping his foot, waiting to see if he would need to physically intervene. And let's not forget Edward's old flame Nate. How he showed up out of the blue and threw the family into even further chaos, with his we can work together ethics and talk of demons. It didn't take a rocket scientist to see that Rosalie was still having trouble thinking demons could even be involved. Those two. She started again, and Edward was about to berate her. Did the one thing I never expected of them. They accepted us. Emmett sighed in relief and settled back into his chair, now no longer worried if he needed restrain his brother, and Edward just stared at Rosalie. Never once did he expect a reaction like this from his usually ice-veined sister. They've got their quirks, that's for sure, but even when they found out what we are, what we do, they still befriended us, and not because they wanted this immortality we have. Dude, I think those two just got Rosie's stamp of approval and they're not even here to see it. Emmett chuckled. Alice giggled and Rosalie looked away, scowling and crossing her arms. Rosie's right, Edward. It's not every day we come across such good friends. Even we can tell that with all the information on Nate's past he isn't telling us that he would in a heartbeat if it was critical. He's a secretive man. Just like my Jasper. Yeah man, don't worry too much. You'll put wrinkles in that forehead of yours. Emmett called out and grinned at Edward's glare. Jasper watched a number of students making their way down the hall, waving to each other and making their way outside. The next time you're around Nate, just observe him. Sometimes, his actions remind me of us. Even though it doesn't always seem like it, he's always alert, never placing his attention on a single thing for too long. He acts in ways that people expect him to, as we do, moving unnecessarily, scratching every so often, and acting as if we are interested in the latest celebrity flub to make idle conversation. Emmett nodded. Yeah, I've noticed that too. It's like he turned it into a game or something. How long can I last until I fuck up? Too bad we've been playing longer than he has. He grinned and glanced at Alice when she leapt up from her seat to stretch. She smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. The last thing we want to do is chase them off. Now come on, I saw something that'll cheer us up. She bounded off in the direction the other students had been heading the entire time of their discussion, and with one questioning look at each other her siblings followed. Hey! I had nothing to do with this, Newton. So lay off. They heard and they maneuvered through the crowd in the parking lot to see what captured everyone's attention. Seeing Nate standing there, his hands held up mock defense as Mike Newton yelled at him for ruining his truck and reputation, as well as other obscenities. The girl Nate was standing with, Jessica something, was trying hard not to laugh at her red-faced ex, and nearby teachers were trying to usher the crowd back inside. Emmett let out a loud guffaw when he saw the blonde adopt an extremely convincing innocent look that more than likely fooled all those that didn't really know him. The principal, now able to make an appearance, took one look at the truck and paled, but circled it nonetheless for any evidence of who could have done this. She let out a sigh when she made her way to the other side of the truck. Mr. Newton? She called and waved for him to come over, pointing out the scrawled foam words to him, and the insignia. Stallions rule! Go home, Spartan faggots! The Stallions in question being the name of another football team currently in the high school division of the area, and they the Spartans. It seems as if this was all a prank by our upcoming match competitors. Rest assured I'll be making a call tonight, but what was this all about blaming Mr. Riven? She asked, and a blush decorated Mike's cheeks. Their previous teacher, Mr. Simmons, spoke up. Mr. Newton has been throwing paper wads at Mr. Riven for most of this semester, and must have thought the boy retaliated. Riven never left my class, Principal Ortiz. She nodded at the information and leveled Mike with a disappointed look. We'll chat about this later, Mr. Newton. For now let's make a quick call, shall we? The crowd dissipated now that the scene was over, and the Cullens walked over to Nate. Now that was the funniest things I've seen in a while. Emmett laughed, and Nate nodded. He shouldn't have pissed me off. Emmett just laughed louder and clapped the blonde on the back hard enough to make him pitch a step. Remind me never to do that. What the hell did you do to make him so angry in the first place? Although you didn't want to draw attention to yourself? Jessica, suddenly feeling very self-conscious at the fact that the Cullens were making idle conversation with one of her best male friends, squeaked in, that'd be my fault. Mikey didn't take very well the day she dumped him. Nate offered and shrugged. Idiot tried to manhandle her. In a very vacant hallway, might I add? Yeah, Nate stopped him when he tried to touch me. Twisted his wrist and slammed him into a locker. Mike has been picking on him ever since, Jessica said and sighed, to which Nate grinned. None of that now, you know I could never leave a damsel in distress. It goes against my code of honor, he said, and Jessica giggled. And since then I've made it my life goal to make his very existence a living hell. He cackled and Emmett eyed him. That was a little evil, but I like it. You've got my vote. Guy's a prick anyway. Yes, because I live for your approval. Nate mock snarled and stretched. Man, All that work made me hungry. Thank Cammy it's lunch. I'll meet you there, Jessie, my sweet. Alice just needs to talk to me about a project. He rubbed his hands together when she left, and Alice pouted. Well, I was going to wait, but you ruined all my fun. Yeah, like I'm not going to point out when you get a vision. Now spill, Alice huffed, but complied. There's going to be a storm tonight, and we usually play a game of baseball during that time. You want in? Nate's grin faltered and he cursed in Japanese. Can't. Jake's picking me up and we're running errands for the pack. Man, sometimes I think I'm the canine with the way they're running me ragged. But hey, if I'm able to get off early I'll swing by. Are you sure? It's really far from our house. Edward slipped in, thinking of the hike the blonde would have to endure. Maybe it would be better if you called and then we could just pick you up. And ruin your guy's game? No thanks, just give me the directions and I'll meet up. Trust me on this, it'll be easier. Nate answered and Alice wrote the directions down on a slip of paper and handed them over. So, hopefully I'll get there in time to play a round or two. Edward's heart nearly started beating again at the thought, but he minutely nodded his head. Oh, I'm so looking forward to this. We need some fresh meat to bat around. Emmett grinned and Nate chuckled and turned to walk back into the cafeteria. I'll see you guys later. The blonde called over his shoulder as he darted around the corner. Edward buried half of his face in the palm of his hand as he leaned against the table, thinking back to what Jasper had said earlier. If he was going to observe Nate in a crowded setting, this period would have to be it because he didn't share any other classes with the blonde. Nate stared at the board as the English teacher droned on about term papers, looking as if he was fighting off the urge to go to sleep. He yawned and glanced back at the clock. That was when Edward saw it. Nate's eyes roamed discreetly over each and every person as he turned back. It was barely noticeable, and from the way the blonde went about it no one would know the difference. But it was still there. Nate took a little more time taking in the empty seat 3 rows back and 2 chairs to the left, but seeing the student make his way back inside with a restroom pass, shifted back. Edward also took note of how Nate would face forward to stare at the board, when his eyes flickered to the shelving units, the flag hanging precariously above the blackboard, a pencil cup on the teacher's desk holding a set of scissors. He was taking inventory of every possible weapon currently in his view. Edward realized and looked back at his own paper, though it wasn't long before the blonde was again the object of his fixation. Nate's tan hand swept across the table to press lightly on a small pile of notes he had previously taken, pushing it until it reached the end of the table. He stopped until the teacher turned his back and nudged it off, sending an array of sheets falling to the middle aisle in a wispy clatter that had everyone glancing back at him. He blinked in a confused manner until he glanced at the papers and grinned. Sorry about that, guess I'm just a little clumsy today, he explained at the teacher's questioning gaze and got up from his chair. See that it doesn't happen again, Mr. Riven. Now, as I was saying. Nate was ignored as he knelt down to retrieve what he dropped, and he turned his back to the board. Edward's gaze went back to the blonde crouched over his notes, and Nate looked directly at him, his eyebrow raised in a "what's the matter" gesture. It was a diversion. Nate created a small scene to get everyone's mind off his constant moving around, and with his back currently positioned towards the teacher there was no chance of him being caught. Nate's action also brought up another thought. In order to do something like this he would have needed to know that Edward was watching him, and as far as the vampire knew he never did anything that others would have noticed. That and Nate's gaze never faced him throughout the entire period. Just when did he have the time to know what Edward was doing? He shook his head, ridding himself of the thoughts, and waved a hand in dismissal to the blonde. Nate nodded his head slightly and reached for the rest of his papers, before sitting back in his seat. Jasper was right, Edward concluded. There was something to Nate that he had never noticed before, which was probably because he had been focusing so much on what he already knew about the blonde. He had no idea of this other Nate, the one that was dangerous on a scale that the vampire had no idea of how high it truly was, and was obviously willing to do anything to keep those precious to him safe. He faced the front, knowing that he would need to watch the blonde far closer than he had been. The leaves rustled as the wind caressed them with a gentle touch high in the trees, but only one dislodged from its place on the branch, and it slowly fluttered to the ground. It weaved and twirled as it fell, until it landed in the outstretched palm of a figure hidden by the shadow made by nearby trees. The man and 7 others shot forward again, so much faster than any other organic creature. Crimson eyes darted back and forth looking for possible prey within distance. Within a few minutes, they spotted something. It was a family of 5, consisting of a mother, father, 2 young daughters and an older son out for a weekend camping trip. The leader's lips curled into a smirk. It really was too bad their time was about to come to an end. James, Victoria, take one of the others and block off all possible escapes. It really wouldn't do if one of them got away now, would it? He said. Of course, Laurent, Victoria answered for both her and her mate, her voice pure seduction, and disappeared into the tree line. Screams rang out that were viciously cut off a few moments later, and Laurent chuckled to himself. The feast had begun. Nate shivered as the wind blew over him, pulling his sweater closer around his neck, and moved farther under the overhang of the school. Stupid Jacob, freaking half an hour late. I ought to castrate the, he mumbled mostly to himself, but grinned when a couple passing high schoolers gave him a strange look. Good night, ladies, he called out as they left, and they blushed before getting into the car. He chuckled. Yup, I've still got it, he said as he heard the familiar low rumbling of Jacob's rabbit. The passenger door popped open and Jacob grinned sheepishly from the driver's side. Sorry about that, man, I kind of decided to catch a nap and overslept, he offered. Nate just shrugged it off. I think my nuts might have frozen, he said, and brought his hands up to cup his angry red ears. Jacob laughed. Sorry. But look at the bright side, at least we only have a few stops to make, then you can head home and stoke up a good fire. Yeah, just step on it and turn that heater up. Some of us don't have those built in. Warm air blasted thought he vents, and Nate held his hands in front of it, sighing in relief. A familiar flash of a light blue cardigan went by. Hey Jake, stop the car. The car came to a stop and Nate stepped out, glancing back at the person, and laughed when she almost slid into him as she came to a halt. What are you doing, Nate? She questioned, glancing up at him. Going to my job. I thought you drove home, Jessica? He asked back, and she blushed. I kind of locked my keys in my car. Is that so? I wish you would have told me, then I could have broken in, but it's too late now, he stated, and Jessica gaped. That's a crime, you know? I can't believe you said that so casually. It's only a crime if I'm caught, he deadpanned and looked back at the rabbit. Hey Jake, we got time for one more stop. Sure, if you hurry your ass up. Nate? A hesitant voice asked. Yeah? There are only 2 seats. The blonde grinned at her. That's why you're going to be sitting in my lap. He sat down and leaned back into the seat, giving an almost lecherous grin. Now come and tell Santa what you want for Christmas. He patted his lap in a come-hither motion. I promise not to bite. God, Nate. You do realize you sound like a pervy old man, don't you? Jessica laughed out and Nate huffed. Geez, you crack one joke and you're labeled forever. Come on, we don't have all day, and as good as that shade of blue looks on you, your lips and ears do not need to be tinged with it. Jessica weighed her options, but the heat coming from the open door made up her mind for her, and she wiggled in. Jacob sighed and looked over at his newly acquired passenger that Nate seemed to attract like fleas, stilling immediately. Nate noticed a lack of motion and faraway look in the wolf's eyes, before grinning. Jessica, I'd like you to meet my best friend, Jacob Black. Jake, this is Jessica Stanley. Nice to meet you, Jacob. She held up a proffered hand, which he shook dumbly, before regaining his senses. Oh, and nice to meet you too. He gave a shaky grin. Smooth, Jacob, smooth. Nate thought, you want me to drive, buddy? Then she could sit in your lap. And let the teasing commence. And no, I'm good. Where to exactly? 3 miles down this road and hang a left at the light, then it's about 4 doors down. Nate replied, and Jessica gave him a look. Just how did you know that? Oh, guess you caught me. I stalk you all right? There, the cat's out of the bag now. Nate replied, looking almost wounded. You're just too sweet to resist. Right, Jessica rolled her eyes and Nate laughed. Jacob watched the two interact periodically, but kept most of his gaze on the road in front of him. It was strange watching Nate flirt with who he now knew to be his intended, but he didn't feel threatened. Not in the slightest, though from afar the two could be mistaken as lovers, he supposed, from how close the two stood next to each other, the casual glances, how he teasingly pulled on a lock of her hair, and she did the same. The list went on really. However, as they pulled up to her house and she got out, thanking both him and Nate for their generosity, that he knew they were only good friends and nothing more. He put the car into gear and it lurched forward when he felt an involuntary shiver travel down his spine, and looking over into the passenger seat to see the blonde grinning at him did nothing to appease it. "So, Jessie, huh?" he questioned, his eyebrows waggling. "Shut it," Jacob growled, and Nate held his hands up in defense. "I'm not saying anything. Just wanted you to know that if you hurt her, you'll shoot to the top of my prank list. That, and there's a dance going on in a few weeks." The blonde rattled off, completely ignoring the glare that changed into an inquisitive look from Jacob. Is she going with anyone?" he questioned, the smug feeling currently emanating from the seat next to him multiplying tenfold. Mikey tried to ask her. She kicked him in the nuts in answer. "Though I did hear Eric, John, Henry and Luke say they wanted to, but then again that's none of my business," he said, each name he mentioned making Jacob pale further. "All right, I may be exaggerating a bit," Nate thought, looking at his handiwork. He really needs to step up to the plate though. "Now come on. We've got 3 more stops to make and I have plans." Fine. The rabbit revved up and Nate forced himself not to smirk. Bella groaned as her father grilled her about her love interest. "Charlie, we're going to play baseball with his family. Not run off to Vegas." "Hey now, don't joke about that kind of stuff, Bella, and baseball." "You're playing?" he asked, disbelief lacing his tone before turning into full-blown laughter. "Yeah, thanks for the vote of confidence, old man, but to answer your question, I'll probably be watching most of the time." She sighed and fought the urge to roll her eyes when his gaze turned inquisitive on her, no doubt wondering when her infatuation became so deep. She needed to leave and fast if she was going to escape the barrage of questions. Hearing a familiar engine outside and the doorbell a moment later, she tried to bolt, she really did, but her father beat her to the door. "Come on in, Edward," he said when he opened the door. "Thank you, Chief Swan," Edward replied back, knowing from the look in the man's eyes that anything less respectful would warrant the use of a shotgun. "Please call me Charlie. I can take your jacket if you want." "Thank you, sir." Hook, line and sinker. Bella couldn't help but think as Edward took a seat on the couch, but sighed when he winked behind Charlie's back. At least he had a plan. "Bella tells me you're going to play baseball." "That is the plan." "Well, if anybody can get Bella to do that, I'm sure you can." Charlie laughed out and Edward joined in. Bella felt the stab at her pride and stood up before her father could break anything else out. "Dad, before you make another joke, may I kindly remind you who makes your meals?" Charlie paled and nodded. "All right, fine, get out of here, but not too late, Belle." He leveled Edward with the famous parental look. "You take care of my girl, you hear?" Bella resisted the urge to groan again as the two seemed to share a separate moment of understanding. "She'll be safe with me, sir, I give you my word." Well, I'm sure Charlie couldn't find any doubt in that statement. She thought, every word practically rang with sincerity. She stepped out of the house and halted. Right behind her truck was a Jeep on steroids. It was huge, with the tires being higher than her waist and spotlights on the roof. It looked like it belonged in the outback. Bella heard a whistle of appreciation behind her and her father stuttered out, make sure to wear your seatbelts." "What is all this?" she questioned as she eyes the number of harnesses coming off from the passenger seat. "Oh, it's an off-road harness. And where are we going exactly?" she squeaked out, thinking off all the places a Jeep like that was capable of reaching as she tried to get all the buckets to fit in the right places, sighing when Edward reached over to do it for her. He smiled lightly. "It's nowhere like that, Bella. Besides, we're not driving the whole way." "Oh, well, alright, that's..." "Wait, just how are we reaching this place if we're not driving the whole way?" "Running," he stated and put the car into gear. "Thank Cammy! We're done, we're finally done!" Nate cried out in a theatrical manner, throwing his hand into the air, and Jacob huffed. "It wasn't that bad, Riven." "Sure, maybe not to you. I mean, you did find your imprint today. That's got to count for something." Nate rebutted and Jacob rolled his eyes, but he did grin. "See? You're grinning like a fool already. Girls will do that to you. Man, I thought you were gay." Jacob deadpanned and ignored the dirty look shot his way. "I'm by Jake, meaning it really doesn't matter if they have a dick or not. If I like him, I'll do him," Nate retorted, grinning at the look of horror on the wolf's face. "Too much info, man, way too much." Nate chuckled. You asked? It's not my fault your virgin ears can't withstand what I say. All the enemy has to do is call out sex positions and they'll have a weapon to your neck in no time. You're not a wait, no. I don't even want to know. Just go meet up with the Cullens already? Jacob whined pitifully, making Nate laugh. Sure, I can't scar you too much in one session after all. Nate bolted out into the light drizzle and Jacob let out a sigh of relief. Nate zipped up the forest trail, hearing the thunder in the distance. I wonder if they're the ones that are making that noise. He thought, it would certainly explain why they wait under storms to play. He grinned at the thought of a good game, one where he could go all out. He was excited. He jumped of a rocky crag jutting out from the side of a mountain, effectively cutting his time down by another few minutes, before he halted. From where he was he had a clear view of the forest floor and the river running through it, with the clouds hanging down low, threatening to release all the water stored in its depths. It provided such a beautiful picture. The sound of raindrops hitting the water a couple miles away caught his attention, and that was when he realized it. That was all he heard. Even where he was at, where the rain had yet to reach, there was no sound. All the animals were silent. He stilled, focusing his chakra into his eyes and ears to strengthen them, and he caught a slight movement further down into the valley. The sound was barely there, but the slight tapping of someone running reverberated in his ears. A few moments later he counted a total of 8 humanoid figures as they ran along the river bank's edge, but it was the speed they ran at that labeled them as non-human. He caught a flash of crimson red and carefully backed up. Vampires. Victoria reappeared next to Laurent, the front of her dress splattered in specks of red, but it was nothing that couldn't be washed out. Unlike the 2 newcomers, whose front was completely drenched, well, that was to be expected. Any ideas of where to head next, Laurent, dear? She questioned, a pink tongue flicking out to catch a bead of crimson blood gathering in the corner of her lips. He looked thoughtful for a moment, before a crack of thunder rang out, and the corners of his lips curled up in a smirk. Oh, I think I might have a small idea. Carlyle stepped up to the plate, a bat ready in his hands, while Edward was in the catching position. Just as Alice wound up another pitch she gasped, and Edward's head snapped up to look at his sister, and there was an instant understanding that flowed between the two. He appeared at Bella's side, before anyone could ask what was wrong. Alice? Esme questioned, her voice tense and wary. How? I didn't see. Why didn't I see? She whispered, a hand flying to her mouth in horror. By this time the others had all gathered, Bella in the middle, shielding her from whatever Alice had seen. Alice. What did you see? Carlyle questioned, stressing the urgency in his voice. I had the wrong perspective. They were much closer than I thought they were. They heard us playing, and it changed their path. 7 pairs of eyes flashed towards Bella, then away. How much time do we have? Carlyle asked and glanced at Edward. We have less than a few minutes. They're running because they want to play, but it goes blank after that. Edward scowled. Can you make it, Edward? Carlyle asked, and Edward shook his head. Not caring, he stopped for a moment. And if they catch a scent they'll start hunting, Carlyle. How many are there? Emmett asked, looking at Alice. 8, she answered, and Emmett scoffed. We've had worse odds. Let him come. He flexed his arms. Everyone besides Emmett, the only one in the group that seemed unaffected by the situation, stared at the leader of their coven as he thought of the best route they could possibly take. The one with the fewer casualties. Continue the game, he finally decided, his voice not betraying how worried he actually was. They are only curious after all. It was decided that Esme would now catch and Carlyle would call. He planted himself directly in front of Bella, while the others went back to the field, now periodically scanning the tree line. Edward stood next to Bella, while Alice and Esme positioned themselves around Bella as well. Take your hair down, Bella, he said in a low voice, and Bella obediently pulled the tie out. Seeing the others still, she couldn't help but say, They're here now, aren't they? Yes, stay as still as you can. Keep quiet and please don't move from my side, he said, and pulled her hair down so that it was covering her face. That won't help, Edward, Alice said. Her scent has already saturated the field. I could smell her from across the way. I know, he conceded, frustration coloring his voice. It was another stressful few minutes as they waited, but no one focused on the game anymore. I'm so sorry, Bella, he stated fiercely. I was completely idiotic. Irresponsible to have exposed you like this. His breath hitched, and his gaze narrowed to the right side of the field. Everyone turned to the same direction, hearing far more than Bella was able to. If anyone asked Bella what it had been like, she would have said it was as if she was watching a scene from a movie. Each person emerged from the tree line one by one, ranging 10 or 12 feet apart. Everyone else followed the man out in front, the one that was clearly their designated leader and two others, the leader being a tall, dark-haired man that held himself with authority, while the others loosely converged around him. The second was a woman whose striking feature was her fiery red hair, and the third man being slightly smaller than his leader, with dirty blonde hair. Bella couldn't help but notice the difference between the Cullens and the others. Their gait was utterly animalistic, to the point of being cat-like, stalking and shifting, always ready to attack. They looked unkempt, like dirty hikers that had been lost on a 7-day journey, and were now finally seeing the first signs of civilization. Sharp eyes carefully took in each and every one of the Cullens, assessing them, and the leader smiled, a flash of gleaming white teeth coming into view. It was the woman, though, that set Bella on edge. She was wilder than the rest, never standing still for more than a second. Their eyes were also far more different than what she was used to seeing, being a deep crimson red that seemed to flash with something sinister and dark. "Hello, I am Laurent. These are James and Victoria. The 5 behind us are Chris, Michael, Wes, Jeff, and Thomas. We thought we heard a game." As they were speaking, the slightest of breezes ruffled the wisps of Bella's hair, and Edward stiffened. The second male, James, the second in command, suddenly focused his gaze on the girl, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent. He suddenly lurched forward into a crouch, a feral snarl ripping its way through his throat. Not unlike a panther, and Victoria joined him as well. Laurent's eyes narrowed on her. My, what is this?" he exclaimed in surprise, and neither Edwards nor James relaxed their positions. "She's with us," Carlyle stated, his voice directed to James. "You brought a snack?" Laurent questioned, belief lacing his tone, and understanding dawned on his features. Edwards snarled even more harshly. "A human," James snarled. "This goes against our very code." He hissed out next, Carlyle stiffening. "They aren't allowed to know." James' hand twitched lightly, and he straightened slightly out of his defensive crouch. Laurent let out a long sigh. "I am afraid that James is right." He held out a hand, and the rest of his coven followed it, tensing. Edward, seeing what the man had planned, had only enough time to call out, "No!" before Laurent's hand dropped rapidly and the others shot off into the woods. 3 things happened simultaneously. Bella was thrown over Alice's shoulder, as she and Rosalie ran back to the jeep, while the rest of the family took off after the other coven, and the traveler burst forth from the forest line running in the direction of the other 2. "Holy shit, that fucker's fast!" Emmett called out as he watched the traveler ruthlessly chase down the others, he having already caught his own prey and ripped him to shreds. "How can we be sure he's really on our side?" Jasper asked as he twisted the head of the newborn he caught and threw it onto the growing pile. How about that?" Jasper looked in the direction his brother was facing to see the man in question throw 2 projectiles joined together with a wire towards the other newborn. He stopped as it swung around him and the tree in front of him. Emmett winced when he saw it tighten and cut the newborn in half. However, he didn't stop. He ran past the mess he created towards the last one, preparing to do the same thing to him that he did to the other. A loud snapping from his left caught his attention, but by then it was too late. Laurent came thrashing through the trees right towards the traveler. "Oh, sure," was all Emmett was capable of saying, and he ran forward intending to throw the other assailant off guard, but could only watch as the dark-haired vampire was able to clip the traveler. Blood sprayed over the forest floor, from what looked to be a deep wound on his side, and his body lurched back from the impact. He smashed into the base of a tree as Laurent made his escape, but through one last kunai with a small slip of paper tied on with nothing more than a thread. Both Emmett and Jasper heard a slight sizzling as it flew through the air, and they ran after Laurent since it seemed the traveler had the other taken care of. The kunai embedded into the young vampire's back. He pitched forward from the impact, and suddenly there was an explosion that shook the forest floor. A few moments later they returned, not being able to catch up to Laurent, and by this time the others had joined back, and they watched as the traveler got up from his position on the ground slightly unsteady. and when he was fully standing kicked the base of the tree in a juvenile manner. He angrily ripped off his mask and glared at the group. Emmett's jaw clicked open, Jasper's eyes widened in comprehension, as did Edward's, Esme's, and Carlyle's. That could have gone better, Nate said, trying to calm his breathing, and pulled off the ski mask that hid head hair, only to bunch it up at his wound. Dude, you're the Traveler? Emmett asked, disbelief lacing his tone, and Nate gave a confused look. The who? He asked dumbly. Who in the world is that? That's you, Emmett said, exasperated, and Nate grinned. I've been called a lot of things in my life, but that is definitely not one of them, but enough of that. Did you guys get the others? Emmett nodded, as did the others, and Nate sighed. Thank Cammy, I was able to get 2 newborns, but Laurent sideswiped me and got me off guard. He looked at Emmett and Jasper. I saw you 2 chasing after him. Is he gone? Emmett and Jasper shared a look. He was already too far out for us to do anything about it. He got away, Emmett voiced, his tone ladled with disappointment, and Nate noticed the look of horror cross over Edward's features. You are wounded, Nate. Here, let me take a look at that, Carlyle said, and made his way over, being careful to not cause any more damage. Were you bit? Nah, he's got sharp claws though, Nate said, and pulled what he was using to staunch the bleeding away for the vampire to get a closer look. I'm going to need to stitch this, he remarked, and Nate nodded. Sure, but hang on. Edward? He looked at the vampire. What did Laurent think that set you so on edge? Edward shifted slightly. He wasn't joking when he said that allowing human to know of us was going against the code, and he follows it to a T. He is going to the Volturi as we speak to inform them of our indiscretion, and they will punish us for it. How long would you say we have? Jasper questioned, and Edward looked down at the ground. 2 weeks at the most, maybe less. Nate listened to the Cullen family arguing back and forth quietly from the corner of the room he chose to inhabit. The blonde was currently leaning against it in a way to rest his now stitched side, having declined the chair Jasper had pulled out from the dining room for him. 47 stitches. That was how many it took to close the jagged rip traveling from just under his right pectoral, following the line of his ribs to curl around his side and make a 45-degree angle to disappear about an inch into the waistline of his pants. The total length of the thing was 11 inches and deep too. Thankfully it hadn't gone any further than that. Carlyle had said he was lucky it didn't cut any further than it had, because then he would be facing the problem of internal bleeding, and after complying with Carlyle's demands to see him if the bleeding got any worse, he was left alone, for the moment at least. He sighed when the argument grew more heated, feeling the oncoming pre-headache waves he was getting. Then again he did smack his head pretty hard on that tree earlier. Maybe it was delayed. And what would you have us do, Carlyle? Rosalie's voice broke through his thoughts, and he looked up to see the blonde glaring. But he could see the utter hopelessness she was trying so hard to hide behind it. That look didn't suit her. It didn't suit any of them. I understand what you're saying, Rosalie, Carlyle conceded, but we can't risk bringing any other covens into this. Nate shook his head. As much as he hated to say it at the moment, Carlyle was right. Another coven wasn't going to risk themselves going against the coven that technically ruled them all. That was virtually suicide, and out here it was every man for himself. Nate looked back up to see the majority of the Cullens looking up at him, and realized that he missed a question that was obviously aimed towards him. He tried to get a read of their expressions, but came up with nothing. So, he said the only thing that came to mind at the moment. Huh! Rosalie rolled her eyes. Well, at least we know you're paying attention to our plight. She muttered, though I suppose we could be stuck with worse. The statements were drizzling with sarcasm and were meant to be jabs at the blonde's intelligence, but the most she prompted was a small grin, accompanied with a slight wince when he shifted. That grin quickly shifted to a confused look. Well, hey, if you're not happy with me, I could always call Jacob up, he offered innocently, ignoring the glare sent his way. Of course, then you'd complain about his scent. You know what? I think you'd be losing both ways, he said in a cheery manner and clapped his hands together once. So you pick? You can either deal with Jake's scent, or my stupidity. And with that he faced away from her, focusing instead on Carlyle. He knew she was stressed from the recent events, but taking it out on him was a battle that she was going to lose. He himself, being in pain, was in no mood to deal with her shit. Would you mind repeating that? He questioned softly and waited for a response. Of course, we were just discussing what you and Jacob have said about having the wolves aid. We think it would be best if everyone would keep to themselves and not draw any attention. Nate nodded, seeing where this was going. You're planning on running? He stated smoothly, knowing this was probably their only option. Yes, Edward is planning on taking Bella back to Phoenix and then following us to South America. Sending her back to Phoenix. It'll be like trying to find a needle in a haystack, if that is Chief Swan doesn't blab. It's not like they know exactly who she is. He thought to himself. An interesting route, Nate conceded, seeing the possibilities. But you do realize you'll probably be on the run for the rest of your existence? Carlyle sighed, but nodded. It's better than the alternative. Nate just shifted. Do these people fear death that much? He couldn't help but think. He, being raised from day one knowing just how high the possibility of losing his life while on a mission or even walking down the street, in his case, actually was, found his new friend's attitude towards it to be strange. Those who died defending those they cherished were held so far above others that chose to nothing at all, because they had the drive, the tenacity to want to protect people who were unable to. They were mourned, of course, for a brief time, but to mourn them any longer, to keep living in the past, was disgraceful. Those ninja gave their lives so that others could keep living for the future, and to do anything but would dishonor them. Those lost would have their names added to the memorial stone, so that their sacrifices were never forgotten, but then life would move on. He had seen people that had dallied too long in the past, a prime example being his old sensei, Kakashi, seeing the man standing in front of the stone, absently tracing Obito's name on the stone as raindrops tracked the long tendrils of his silver hair, forlornly, was something he never wanted to see again. He had always known that death's only victims were the people left behind. There was one thing he understood though. The need to protect those close to you, to protect family, and that was exactly what Carlyle was doing. It was admirable, and it was the way of the shinobi. And it was with that thought in mind that he came to a decision. The Cullens did nothing to deserve this fate, and damn him to the lowest pit of hell if he allowed it to take place. Understood, I'll inform the pack. He stated simply, ignoring Rosalie's inquisitive look, and rose from his seat. You have my number, Carlyle. Just give me a ring before you leave and give it to Bella as well. He turned to face the girl in question. You ever need anything, don't hesitate to give me a call. Thank you, Nate. She said in a small voice and snuggled further into the crook of Edward's arm. As he stepped out the door, he completely missed the glance Edward gave him as well. Thank you for bringing me home, Edward. Bella mumbled as she was encased in his arms. She tried not to think about the next few days, the days where he would have no choice but to leave her. It hurt, knowing that she had been the one to cause this, to bring the wrath of the Volturi down on the Cullens' heads, but from the way the family reacted, they knew of the consequences too. They still allowed it though. If she had known, she would have kept to herself and away from the Cullens. Far, far away. It was too late now, though, and the entire Cullen family was paying because she forced her way into their secret. As if knowing what she was thinking, Edward's grip tightened around her. None of this is your fault, Bella. He whispered comfortingly. My family and I knew what would happen should we be caught. It was just bad luck on our part, I guess. Bella nodded and thought back to the look she had seen Edward give Nate as he left, a look filled with so much emotion she wasn't able to discern between them. It was a look of longing, almost like. She fought to slow her heartbeat back down as it sped up rapidly, cursing the organ for giving her thoughts away so easily. It was also a plus Edward was unable to read her mind as wheels turned and gears clicked into place. Edward was in love with Nate. Still loved him, she realized as pieces began to fit together. It was so obvious to her now that she was actually berating herself for not seeing it before, for being so blind. She would often find Edward looking over at the blonde when he wasn't looking, and the action happened so often she was certain even he didn't know he was doing it anymore. Then there was Nate's blatant avoidance of the entire situation. Nate would not look Edward in the eyes unless he had to, and that was the same when they were paired up for an English assignment, or if they met somewhere on the streets. Even she had noticed the blonde's knack of knowing everything that was going on around him, even as his back was turned. How could he not know how often Edward's gaze drifted towards him? The truth was simple, he was ignoring it, because the feelings between both of them was still there, and they were fighting it. Nate she could understand. He wasn't doing anything because of her. She automatically fell into the friend category the blonde had, and in turn he would avoid hurting her. Possibly even to the point of cutting one of his own fingers off he had to. Nate, she noticed, was just that kind of person, loyal even if it maimed him, or killed him. He never gave up anything without a fight, which unfortunately brought up one last facet. Earlier, he just complied with Carlyle's answer and set out to do what he was asked of. Normally, he would have laid another plan onto the table, but this time, nothing. He let go far too easily. No, she was positive he was up to something. The question, though, was what? As Edward released her at the door and bid her farewell, she began formulating plans. If those two were too thick-headed to see just how much they still cared for each other, she was going to make them. Boys could be such idiots at times, she concluded and walked inside. Alice smiled as she caught the tail of her last vision. It seemed she now had a partner in her quest. Esme, I'm going to step out for a while, she called out as she stepped out the door and made her way to the forest. She ran alongside the windy trails, making sure to keep out of view of them in case of a late-night hiker, and stopped a few meters away from what she knew to be her brother's favorite tree. The tree he often inhabited when he was brooding. Schooling her thoughts, she made her way up to the base. I am not brooding, Alice. Just thinking. A voice issued from above and she giggled. Oh, he was brooding all right. Edward, get down here, we need to talk. She called out herself and waited for the soft-sounding impact. He came down a few moments later, and she sighed. He, himself, caught what she was about to say as it entered her mind and swiftly shook his head. Honestly, Alice, he sighed, how many times do we have to go over this? I am not in love with Nate. That is all in the past now. And Bella is your world now. Please cut the dramatics, Edward, I know already. She cut in, ignoring her brother's glare. And I understand, just... She took a worried breath, the same a soldier would have done when the battle was over with, and looked at him with silent resignation. Please, just don't confuse love with adoration, she pleaded and turned back to head home, leaving him to his thoughts. He stilled for a moment at her statement. Confuse love with adoration. Her declaration almost sounded like a warning. He had loved Nate at one point in time. He would never deny that, but he had given up expecting the blonde to forget him, and live a long, fulfilling life with someone who was able to age with him. As a newborn and the years before meeting Bella, he would often find his mind going back to the time he and Nate spent together, but that still didn't stop him from thinking about what the blonde was doing now. Thinking about the life he was leading and how he was no longer in it, how the blonde's exuberant attitude probably rubbed off on any kids he had with his spouse or adopted. It was easy to imagine the blonde surrounded by 6 or 7 children, all with blue eyes or blonde hair, knowing he would have no problem keeping up with them all. Nate would have made a perfect father. By the time Bella came around, he no longer allowed himself to think back because being nearly 100 years later he knew it was time to move on, and she managed to sweep him with a force all her own. She was the only other person he felt anything for. So, naturally he followed that pull and allowed the clasps of his last relationship to fall away and plunged head first into the one he shared with Bella. But then Nate returned. The very person that he had taken over 90 years to let go of, thinking the blonde was nothing more than a mere memory, and threw his life into a whirlpool once more. He found himself questioning how he really felt, and the more he thought about it the more he found he was leaning away from Bella. He hated to think he was being unfaithful, but to have thoughts of another while being in a relationship was cheating in a way, wasn't it? One thing was for sure, he was going to need to think further on this. 10 minutes before, Nate took to the trees as soon as he left the Cullens' property, trying to put as much distance between himself and them. Once he was out of hearing range he stopped, and waited. A few moments later he heard the telltale crunch of pine needles from behind him and turned to face his newest stalker. Did you need something, Rosalie? Rosalie, never being one to dance around the bush, asked bluntly. Just what are you planning? Nate threw back his head in a laugh at his counterpart's question and instead of answering turned the question back on her. Just what makes you think I'm planning anything at all? Rosalie's eyes narrowed. Because as much as I despise saying it, you have the same gleam in your eyes my husband has when he's up to something. Now tell me. Nate sighed. Honestly, sometimes Rosalie was too observant for her own good. Well, at least she was the one to catch him, and not anyone else. The others allowed their emotions to rule them too much. At least Rosalie could stand back and consider all the options from a detached point of view when needed. Why do you need to know? Your family is moving. Bella is going to be safe. The pack won't do anything until the Volturi have left, so what does it matter what I do? Rosalie stopped for a moment. As much as she hated to admit it, the blonde did have a point. What did it matter if she did know? Her family was going to be unaffected anyway, seeing as how Nate wasn't the type to squeal on others. The question was, why did she care? Before she could come up with an adequate answer, he started to walk away, but stopped when Rosalie regained her voice. I don't understand. How can you be so? She never finished the question, and Nate turned to face her, cerulean eyes studying her with an almost calculating gaze she never took notice of before. That's just who I am. He answered simply and disappeared from view in a flurry of leaves. Meanwhile, candles flickered from their holders, the only light in the windowless room. 3 figures sat in ornately carved chairs, along with a young girl and a young boy, and listened to the soft music playing in the background. The first 2 seemed contented to merely lay back, their red eyes closed, and listen to the music. It was the figure in the middle was currently stroking a fine beard as he contemplated the best move to make on the chess board in front of him. His opponent, the young girl, waited patiently for the man to continue, while her brother watched. Suddenly the old man chuckled. My, someone has been practicing. He commented offhandedly, and she smiled in return at the compliment. Thank you, sir. Ah, but it seems you need to practice just a little more, Jane, my dear. He grabbed the queen and positioned her a few squares away from the opposite queen. Checkmate. She pouted slightly, and her brother brought a comforting hand to her shoulder. Do not feel bad, my dear. I have been playing far longer than you have, but this was a good game. A few moments later, and the doors opened to reveal a handful of guards, escorting another vampire, which by the looks of him had seen better days. My masters, I apologize for disturbing you, but this trespasser has asked for your time. He has said it was urgent. The head of the guard said and stepped back, waiting for further orders. It was a long moment before Arrow turned to face them and nodded. Allow him passage. It had been a while since we were entertained last. The dark-haired vampire stepped forward and bowed low to show respect once he reached the beginning on the stairs. Seeing Arrow nod again, he spoke. Sirs, I come here tonight to tell you of a clan that has broken your sacred rule. Arrow's eyes raised and disappeared into his hairline, milky white eyes almost contemplative. Please step forward, my child, he said, and the vampire did as he was told, kneeling once he reached the man's side. Your name? Loran, my master. Loran, allow me to witness their indiscretion myself? He asked and held out a palm. Loran looked at Arrow's hand and cautiously allowed his fingertips to rest in the open palm. Everything he saw unknowingly transferred over to the centuries-old being. Ah, Carlyle, I never would have thought he would allow for such a thing to occur. What have you seen, brother? Questioned the man in the next seat over, red eyes opening to gaze at his brother. Merely one of the covens is breaking one of the high laws, Brother Caius. Arrow answered, looking back at his brother. The Cullen coven, I am afraid. Cullen? As in Carlyle Cullen and his family? Caius asked, clearly remembering when they extended their own offers to 2 of their brood. Yes, they have allowed a human girl to live even though she knows of what they are. An utter disgrace, allowing themselves to mingle with such commoner filth. At what time shall we leave, brother? I dare say they deserve a sentence for their crimes. As do I, brother. The girls shall have to be dispatched of quickly, but young Alice and Edward will be given another chance to join us. If they do not, then we shall dispatch of them as well, along with the rest of their little family. Arrow stated, and Caius nodded in agreement. Very well, shall we leave in a few days? Yes, I'm sure by now they already know we're coming. We should allow them the time to prepare. You may leave now, Loran. Our doors shall always be open to you for informing us. Arrow stated, and Loran gave another low bow. Thank you, my masters, he said, and left. Marcus watched the scene with little interest and looked back to the twins. Their eyes were now glinting with excitement as they played the next round of chess with each other. Soon, my dear brother, very soon, he heard from Arrow and closed his eyes again, drowning himself in the music. Oh no! Alice muttered as she wrapped some of the more fragile items they owned in paper before putting it into a box. Is something wrong, Alice? Jasper asked, placing the box he was carrying by the door. Yes, our future's just fizzled out. I don't think we get on the plane. But if we do not get on the plane, then what do we do? Just wait around here and await our demise? Rosalie's voice drifted from the stairs, and she made her way into the living room. No, that's just it. The last thing I saw was us waiting in the living room. Everyone seemed worried, but I couldn't tell when the Volturi were coming, Alice remarked as she remembered the vision. Rosalie, if she saw us here and not on that flight, then something must have happened. Keep packing, and unless something changes, we'll drive out of town on the back roads, Carlyle stated from above them. Alice nodded and started to wrap a nearby vase. Nate retrieved his slim cell phone from his back pocket and dialed a number that was so ingrained into his memory that he no longer needed to look at the sheet he had written it on. After a few rings, someone on the receiving line finally picked it up. Yeah? The voice questioned. Hey Jake, it's me. Nate answered back in a bored tone. We ran into some problems. The Volturi are coming. All of them. Absolute silence filled the reception, before Jacob replied back with a shaky voice. Please tell me you're shitting me? He pleaded, and Nate sighed. No, Edward has said we have a few days at the most, and Alice confirmed it. She saw them in the forest. So, knowing you've already figured out what it is the Cullens want to do, and what we should do. Nate smirked and switched the phone to his other ear. It was the first thing I did naturally. So what did they decide to do? They figured they have no choice but to run. I mean, come on. The entire Volturi are going to be on their asses like white on rice unless they get out now. He heard Jacob's affirming snort on the other end and continued. They're going to take Bella back to Phoenix and take off the South America. That's great and all, but what about us? The Volturi can't wait forever, and they won't take the chance of wiping out an entire town. It would raise too many questions. The Cullens want us to lay low and wait until they leave. Think of it as a vacation. Yeah, one where we won't be leaving our homes. Was retorted on the other line, and Nate sighed. It's better than them wiping the entire pack out. Then where would we be? Yeah, I guess you're right. So, when does this vacation begin? As soon as you get back from whatever lovely thing you're up to now, Nate answered. Alright, man. I'll tell the rest of the pack stay safe. Nate smiled slightly, but felt a weight pressed down on his chest. This was more than likely the last time he would speak to the wolf. He wanted to say something more, to tell him how he and the rest of the pack had been such good friends to him, but to say anything along those lines would give him away. So, he settled on a mere, you too man, you too, and snapped the phone shut, slipping it into his back pocket. He couldn't help but feel as if he betrayed one of his best friends. But it would all be for the best soon enough, and Nate could only hope Jake, the rest of the pack, the Cullens and Bella would forgive him eventually. If they didn't, he would understand. He saw his house in the distance, and sped up his pace. But instead of heading inside, he took a detour, and made his way to the shed out back. There was nothing really special about it, just a 10 by 10 storage shed, painted white around 10 years ago if the peeling paint of brown patches were anything to go by. He deftly maneuvered around the door, making sure not to upset the squeaky hinges, and pulled on the small cord connected to a single light bulb above him, lighting the room slightly. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes that had various knickknacks among them, but none of these boxes held his interest. No, he was focused on the baseboards beneath him, and a particular one in fact. He started from the door and counted 2 steps in, before counting 3 more to the left. Hearing a slight squeak, he stopped and reached down to grab hold of the board he stepped on, easily pulling it free. From there he undid the small last underneath the board parallel to this one, and hearing the clicking of a latch coming undone, pulled that one up as well. It was in fact connected to another 7 baseboards, all connected by a long strip of wood perpendicular to the rest. By doing this he revealed a hidden compartment beneath the shed, and he descended the stairs to reach the bottom, bringing a flashlight from one of the upper shelves with him. It was here he left nearly all of his past, save a few pictures he now kept in his study, but never anything that could cause an uproar, like the picture he had of himself at 15 standing on Gamabunta's head. He looked like nothing more than a mere orange speck standing upon a burgundy-colored mountain. Now that would have been a fun thing to explain. Unfortunately, he wasn't here to reminisce, so he bypassed the photo albums and various letters from friends he refused to part with and headed over to a waterproof container. The only thing he found that would adequately protect paper products from the heavy moisture in the air, and reached inside once he pulled the lid free. His hands grasped at the familiar thin paper, the specially made rice paper he purchased no more than a few months ago on a trip to Port Angeles. It being thicker than what was used in traditional Japanese paper doors, made it more durable and perfect for what he had planned for it. It was the same size of a traditional 9 by 11 sheet of paper used in schools these days, and for once he was glad to have had the forethought to buy as much as he did. There was easily over 4 inches in width of the paper, and while he was sure he wouldn't need that much, he was glad he would have enough. He reached into the box once more to retrieve the green-lined notebook, the first he purchased after landing in the United States, and the one he was spotted drawing in so many times by others. He would often write in it during his free time and was now filled because of his dedication. Inside were calculations surrounding sketches of various jutsus, some of which he knew and others he had been meaning to learn. The one that littered the most pages being the infamous Rasengan. On the first page was the original in its most basic form, developed by the fourth Hokage himself, and the one that was incomplete. He carefully flipped over the many clear sheets he swiped from a teacher's office at Forks High that were commonly used for overhead projections. Each one had a different set of calculations on it for different variations of the same move. First was the Odoma Rasengan that was flipped over the first model. It was significantly larger, far more powerful, and it was a completely original move only he was able to perform because it required the Kyuubi's chakra to form it. Hence no one could copy it. After that came the Rasen Shuriken, a move developed and created entirely by him that utilized the element of wind. 4 curved protrusions broke free from the center, making it take the appearance of a shuriken, which was the reason for its name. The others were merely rough sketches of the same move paired with different elements, ones he had been meaning to try, but hadn't had the time. Even now the signs to perform each one were swimming around in his head, and he was constantly looking for flaws, anything that could potentially harm him or comrades should he use them in battle. He flipped past each one, refreshing his memory on each one, and then flipped to the last page, the last move he had been working on. It was a different rendition of Tsunade's famed massive strength, the very same one she tutored her apprentice, Sakura Haruno, in. The reason he is unable to perform her technique is because, unfortunately, he had nowhere near their control over chakra. She concentrates it in her extremities and releases it when she lands a hit. He spent so long pondering over a way he too could learn how to do this without having the chakra control, and after 3 years of experimentation and calculations, he thinks he may have just found a way. It would need to be done in a quick few steps. If he missed just one, it could turn disastrous quickly. After many tries, he finally figured out how to force a massive amount of chakra into his right arm, the same arm he used to create the Rasengan, which was why he chose it in the first place. When he did it the first time at 15, the move nearly shattered the bones in his entire forearm. The chakra poured into his arm had nowhere else to go and ended up causing a slight explosion in his arm. It was then he figured it out. The only reason that had happened was because he didn't allow it to escape and instead contained it until it backlashed. His chakra was explosive by nature, and if he released it, it would create a small explosion just outside of his hand. Closing the notebook, he sighed, and after closing everything back up the way he had it, made his way inside as it started to drizzle. He brought the items he had inside with him, and pulling out a calligraphy set, a set of scissors, and his seals book, set it down on the coffee table in the living room. He had a lot of work ahead of him if he was going to be ready in the next few days. Nate smirked as he took a step back away from the wall, admiring his handiwork. It was nearly complete. He only had a few more holes to cover, and that would be it. It surprisingly hadn't taken him very long to find the kanji he needed from the seals book, maybe around 30 minutes. It was drawing them all that took so long. Nate had taken the rice paper and cut them in half width-wise to make that previous stack of 4-inch wide papers into 8, before carefully drawing on the appropriate seals. Now he was currently pasting each slip of paper to one of the 4 walls of his chose site. A few moments later and every wall was covered. Now he just needed to wait. Over the next couple of days an almost unnatural fog settled over the town of Forks, and the Cullen family for once couldn't be happier. Everyone had been restricted to their homes unless it was absolutely necessary to venture out because of limited visibility. This of course meant there would be no stray humans out in the woods and fewer casualties in the long run. It was decided that Bella would be staying with the Cullens under the pretenses of attending a sleepover with Alice. Charlie, reluctantly, allowed his daughter to do so, more than likely keeping in mind just how close Edward would be during their sleepover. Alice giggled at the strained look on the man's face when she asked, knowing exactly what was running through the man's mind even without her brother's gift. Now, though, everyone was silent, waiting for anything that sounded out of the ordinary. But Carlyle seemed to be waiting for something more. He hovered near the telephone constantly, and if he wasn't in sight he was always nearby in case it went off. Edward, seeing his father pass by the phone for the 20th time, finally asked, "What are you doing, Carlyle?" Whatever daze the elder vampire had been in broke at Edward's questioning, and with one last glance at the phone he answered his son. Nate usually calls to confirm he finished what he was working on, but this time, nothing. Edward nodded. He may just be a little stressed and forgot to call. He concluded, even though his answer sounded weak to his own ears. Carlyle understood his son's reasoning, but it still didn't stop his worrying. "I understand, but since when does Nate ever forget anything, especially about something this important? Should we go look for him?" "No, he might just be caught up doing something else. I'm sure he'll call soon enough." Carlyle reasoned, even thought the sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach grew with each passing minute. Edward also couldn't seem to shake the same feeling, and he glanced out of the window and into the fog. The dense fog was nothing to them as they walked at a steady pace into a secluded area of the forest, the sun high in the sky even if it was hidden behind a mass amount of clouds. It was the perfect setting to extract retribution. "We shall stop here." Arrow's voice stilled all those under his command. It was a large meadow, which in all rights would have been absolutely beautiful if not for the couple hundred vampires camped within its depths, and the perfect place to prepare for an attack, it being about 20 miles from Forks, their eventual destination. "I am positive young Alice has already seen our arrival. We shall allow them a few hours to come to us on their own, and if not, we shall hunt for them." Arrow called out, and most others cheered in return. The sentries around the camp listened far into the forest, paying no mind to the constant shuffling and tweeting of the forest creatures so far from their encampment. One of the sentries cocked his head to the left, straining to focus his hearing in one direction. His partner, seeing the action, gave an inquisitive look until he answered, "Did you hear that?" He too turned to the same direction to listen for the sound that grasped his partner's attention, and hearing nothing shook his head. "I hear nothing, brother. Maybe you are hearing things in your old age?" "Do not play games with me," his brother growled, but another subtle snap, closer now, caused him to stand. "Are you going to tell me I am hearing things now?" he questioned, seeing the look of comprehension dawning his brother's features. He gestured to get the attention of the vampires further in. "Tell the master someone draws near." The crowd that gathered around the section of woods the sounds emanated from parted as the head of the Volturi made their way to the front, curiousness driving them. From the faltered steps and delicious scent it was clear the intruder could be nothing but human. The snapping of twigs and underbrush grew closer until a slight catching sound followed, and the bushes in front broke free when the human fell through them to land with a soft thump in front of them. She was female from what they could catch as she fell down, and she shifted, forcing herself to stand back up, long, rich brown hair cascading down her shoulders. Her skin was a light ivory, so pale she could have been mistaken for a vampire. But it was her eyes that gave her away. It was not the bright crimson red they were used to, nor the topaz the Cullens sported because of their way of life. No, deep, rich, chocolate brown eyes locked on them with wariness, acknowledgement, motivation, and excitement. What a strange human this one is, Arrow thought to himself. He recognized the girl visage from Lawrence's memories. Normally, humans that knew of what they were would be cowering in fear, begging to not end their life, to change them so they could serve them for eternity. It was amusing to see what the humankind would strive to do for even a second longer of their already pathetic life. The girl carefully rose to her feet, mud covering the front of her beige-covered jacket, and she stilled, finally seeing the audience she had no doubt. A blush stained her cheeks and her eyes widened as she took notice of their blood-colored eyes. Arrow smiled at the reaction, and never being one to forget his manners addressed her. "Hello, my dear." He started, his voice conveying false security, and gestured for no action to be taken as of yet. "It seems to me you are a tad far from home, wouldn't you say?" "What is your name?" She nodded swiftly, her head dipping low so that her eyes were hidden. It's Bella. She whispered, not giving a last name, and continued. Are you the Vivalturi? Yes, and if I am not mistaken you are the human that knows of us? At her nod he smiled again. Well, I'm sorry to say we cannot allow you to live. He stilled a moment at the flash of hatred in the depths of those brown eyes, but wrote it off as a fluke when her eyes filled with apprehension. Arrow sighed. But even knowing that, still you came here, hoping that if you sacrifice yourself we'd leave them be, even going as far as to disobey the Cullen's warning. No doubt they were going to hide you somewhere, but you managed to slip away. How entertaining. He looked at her, faked remorse in his eyes. But I'm afraid we cannot allow the Cullens to go without punishment either. Again she nodded, meekly this time, and it was apparent why. What could she, a mere human, hope to do against a horde of vampires centuries older than her? Arrow nodded and steadily raised a hand to signal one of the guards to dispatch of the girl when she chuckled. At first he thought it might have just been delusion finally settling in, but that sweet chuckle turned dark enough to make him reconsider just killing the girl. She looked up at him, a maniacal gleam in her eyes as they bled into a light blue. Intrigued by the sudden change, Arrow brought his hand back. Maybe there was more to this human than he previously thought? Oh, I understand all right, but you should know not to take everything at face value. It could end up being your demise. She replied back in a sweet tone, her stance changing from the timid girl that first bumbled through the underbrush, to one of more confidence. Caius, not paying attention to the changes and only seeing the girl's impudence, fought not to rush forward and rip her throat out as Arrow had yet to give the command. You foolish child, do you not realize where you stand? How we could squash you like the insect you are? He seethed and Bella gave him a bored look. Yes, so? She replied cheekily and turned her attention back to Arrow. Before you go through with this, you should know that I'm not really Bella. Arrow's eyes widened, and watched as the sound of a small explosion reached his ears, followed by a cloud of smoke, that caused the entire group of vampires to back up in apprehension, leaving around 70 feet for their intruder to move about, and if need be to attack her. The smoke cleared to reveal a young man clad in one of the strangest fashions he had ever seen. A pair of black bottoms, loose enough to allow for movement, was taped with white binding tape around his calves and disappeared into the rim of his black sandal-like shoes. There was also tape around his waist to keep his dark crimson, sleeveless shirt from riding up and his pants to keep from slipping down. Apart from that, he wore a pair of black leather gloves and 2 pouches, one strapped to his upper right side and a larger pouch perched on his lower back. Blonde hair was in wild disarray, long strands framing his face perfectly, and bright cerulean-colored eyes peeked out in a calculating stare. To say that Arrow was intrigued was an understatement. How interesting, he murmured, stroking his fine beard in thought. I clearly saw a woman standing there, and yet, you appear. Tell me, dear brother, did I see wrong? He turned to Caius, and he too had an astonished look on his face. Tell me, boy, what is your name? The blonde in front of him scoffed at the demand and gave the vampire a pointed look. I go by Nate, he stated simply, not looking the slightest bit paranoid at the younger vampires moving to block off his escape. Nate? All right, then tell me. How did you transform in such a way? Is it a gift? Arrow's voice was tinged with curiosity, as he imagined that particular gift among his ranks, and Nate smirked. Of course it is. Now I'm giving you a choice. Either go back to Italy and leave the Cullens alone, or you can choose to die here today. A bubbled laughter forced its way from Arrow's chest at the blatant arrogance of this young fool, and he didn't stop it. It had been a long time since anyone showed such disrespect to them, and in all honesty he missed all that vigor their opponents had before they were slaughtered, and to think a puny human thought they even stood a chance against them. It was laughable. Oh, you certainly are an amusing one, but I am afraid you do not know who you speak to. It is as my brother says, we have much more strength over you both physically and in numbers, Arrow said once his laughter died down, and the blonde shrugged. It's not like I care, I've already warned you. Arrow gave one last look at the blonde and gestured for one of his prizes to come down. She bowed when she reached him. Jane, my dear, if you would. Even though it was a question, it was said as a statement and left no room for an answer. The blonde in front of them stilled, facing his entire body to the one that was about to do something, never once taking his eyes off her. Nate kept his gaze on the one called Jane the entire time. From what he heard from the Cullens, she was a fearsome opponent, something about attacking a person's mind. It reminded far too much of the Sharingan for his liking. Her gaze narrowed at him when he didn't so much as twitch. A moment later, she gave off a loud shriek and Nate looked at her in confusion. Alright, just what the hell did he do now? Arrow's look of interest now increased so that it was now resting somewhere between excitement and awe, a look of a child in a candy store, and Nate didn't like it one bit. Amazing, tell me, does young Edward's gift affect you in any way? Nate blinked and sudden realization dawned on him. He was being tested, for what he didn't know. So instead of answering, he brought his hands together into the first sign of the famed technique he was known for as a child. Enough questions, you really want to see the extent of my abilities, Arrow? I'll let you see them as I'm killing off your coven. Check this out, Tajikage Bunshin no Jutsu. The area behind the blonde Nate was filled with hundreds upon hundreds of clones, all staring malevolently out at the coven before them, and reaching into their pouches to produce a weapon of some kind. The most popular being his kunai, of course. He pointed at the group, a feral grin marring his face, and shouted, "Charge!" The mass amount of Nates lunged forward, reveling in the surprised looks crossing his victims' faces. The front line was the easiest to take down, being filled with nothing but newborns that had no clue how to handle the situation except to follow Arrow's orders of find the original. Unfortunately, while his shadow clones were having an effect, and he had been able to take down a couple dozen vampires, they were being destroyed far too easily by the powerful strikes of his opponents. Running forward, he called out Rasengan and plunged the swirling fist into the enemy's chest in front of him, while two clones grabbed both his arms to rip him apart and threw the pieces to the growing pile behind him. Earlier, he created a couple hundred more clones and sent them into the forests behind the Volturi, to catch any that tried to escape. He wasn't allowing for any survivors today. He couldn't help the growl that escaped him when the one called Alec used that gift of his to bring down 40 of his clones. Their memories transferred to him as they realized they couldn't move and sunk down in the blissful unawareness of his gift. He needed to bring that once down and fast. He brought his hands together to make more clones, but still that the growling from behind him. Found you! Felix hissed, and Nate's eyes widened as he felt the impact of a fist on his right temple. He was thrown a good 30 feet into the raging battle around him, his right ear ringing from the impact. That vampire had a killer right hook. His gaze flew in the direction of Felix, and seeing the vampire running towards him, decided this would be a good time to pull himself together. He jumped up, evading the oncoming hit, that was now complete with a set of razor-sharp nails, he noted ruefully. A few more swipes later and Felix let loose another growl. "Stand still, God damn you!" He hissed, and if Nate had the time he would have shook his head. "Yeah, like I'm going to comply with that," he thought. A few clones around him noticed his problem and jumped forward, latching themselves onto the vampire's arms and legs. He was able to make a swift escape, now that Felix was otherwise incapacitated at the moment. Feeling a few more clones dispel at the tree line, their memories now his own, he noticed a few had tried to run, which consisted of the newborns that had not been cut down by the guard or their own masters. He ran until he was once again lost amongst the confusion, quickly making as many more clones as he dared, trying to conserve the last of his chakra. He grinned when he realized as his small army had finally broken through their third ranks, which meant only a one more until he reached the guard. Only 30 more. He thought to himself, making the signs for another Rasengan. He threw his hand forward, but was stopped by the grip that encircled his wrist, and looking up realized it was none other than Felix. He sure made pretty quick work of those clones. Nate flipped his body over the vampire, ignoring the searing pain that emanated from his wrist, and landed a cracking blow on the vampire's head with his right foot. Hearing the growl, he knew that only served to anger the being further. He was grabbed by the back of his shirt and forced into the ground painfully, nearly eating dirt as his hands were pinned behind his back. "Call them off, you monster, and I might just let your death be swift," Felix hissed, sharp teeth dangerously close to his ear, and he shook his head the best he was able to. "Fine then. What are you?" Nate never finished because the blow to the back of his head, the one feeling as if he was hit by a speeding truck, blurred his vision, and he would have pitched forward from the impact if he wasn't already on the ground. He guessed he would have to make do with the now 2-inch crater he was now laying in, exhaustion, both physically and chakra-wise, finally catching up with him. He unwillingly drifted into the darkness. I should kill, bastard. Nate heard through the recesses of his mind as he was pulled out from his conscious. Bleary blue eyes opened slightly, the light causing him to close them once again, but he didn't move. He didn't want to give himself away, but then again, knowing these assholes they already knew because of his breathing. Oh, how right you are, Nate, my boy, he heard and woke to see the milky eyes of none other than Arrow. He supposed the vampire in front of him could have been beautiful if it wasn't for that damn fake smile of his. Oh, how he wanted to rip it off right at that moment. He took in his surroundings, nearly gleeful at the size of the small mountain of vampire parts he caused, it nearly being twice as tall as he was. Nate shivered at the cold appendage that trailed down the side of his face and looked back to see Arrow, a look of concentration marring his perfect features. My, what an interesting life you have led, young one. He murmured, ignoring the heated glare from the blonde. You have a great power within you, but why, pray tell, did you choose not to use it against us? All right, forget about ripping the smile off, this guy would be better off dead. He'd be doing the world a favor getting rid of that mind-invading thing. How the hell was he able to get in his mind anyway? Like I need the stupid fox to beat a bunch of demon wannabes, he growled out, forcing himself not to wince as Felix's hold on his head and hands tightened. Again the hand trailed down his cheek. Ah, you would be such a wonderful asset to my collection. If only we could do something about this defiant streak of yours. Nate was forced to his knees, feeling blood spill free from a cut on his temple, and he spat back, like I'd ever join the likes of you. Go to hell. Arrow angrily drew his hand back and brought it back to the blonde's cheek in a hard slap that pitched him to the left if not for Felix's hold on him. Nate gasped out, feeling the wind knocked out of him, but soon enough that cold hand was back on his face, nearly caressing his now swelling cheek in a manner he decided he never wanted to see again. Oh, I'm so sorry for ruining that pretty face of yours, Arrow crooned, and Nate realized he might be in deeper shit than he thought. The vampire was treating him like a damn toy, and as he glanced over at the pile of bodies he saw why. There, resting near the bottom of the pile, were Jane and Alec's heads, laying side by side. The old man needed a new toy, and as it turns out Nate happened to fit the description to a T. He shuddered with revulsion, but looked over the vampire's shoulder. Seeing the movement behind him, he caught a flash of yellow and inwardly grinned. There were still a few clones left. If he could just cause a big enough distraction. Far off in the woods, the last 3 clones watched the scene, awaiting further orders, and silent understanding passed between them and the original. It was time for the final plan. The very plan they hoped from the very beginning they wouldn't have to use. They ran further into the woods, careful not to expend any unneeded chakra, and one nearly dove into a nearby bush, coming back out a few moments later with a few noisy fireworks, taped together. Setting it in a small clearing, they quickly lit the fuse and stepped back, it going off a few seconds later. Arrow's head snapped up at the sound, and he sent a few of the guard over to check on the source, his eyes never once leaving Nate. Scuffling could be heard, and Arrow finally looked away, as did Felix, when a body flew out of the woods at high speed. Nate, seeing this as his only chance, quickly twisted his way out of Felix's hold, bringing his knee up to deliver a powerful chakra-enforced blow to the vampire's abdomen that had him crumpling over. The blonde ran over to the pile of body parts. Bringing his hands together to form the signs for another jutsu he forced himself to learn in his time in the United States. Katan Ryoka no Jutsu. A stream of fire poured from Nate's mouth onto the pile, setting it aflame, before he quickly dove into the woods once more. Hearing Arrow's roars of outrage behind him, he quickly made his way to the construction site where his job was usually held. Maybe this wasn't such a bright idea, Nate thought as he pushed his body to its limits, trying to stay ahead of the remaining vampires on his tail. He was running out of steam and fast. He took to the trees, making sure to run against the occasional tree to mark his scent. Suddenly a wash of dizziness overcame him, and his foot missed the initial branch he was going to use to propel himself further. Nate fell straight down, catching smaller branches down along the way, and impacted hard on the forest floor beneath him. Hearing Felix's howl of excitement, he quickly pushed himself to his feet, the wave of dizziness and now moving ground beneath him causing him to stumble. Oh, Cammy, not again, he thought as he fought to keep himself from retching and pushed forward. Not much farther, just a little more. He forced nearly the last of his chakra into his legs to give him a little extra boost, and made it out of the tree line to see the abandoned worksite, and the old iron factory seemingly within arm's reach. Nate smirked and cast one last jutsu, a genjutsu to be exact, with the last of his chakra, and kept running. He reached the doors and opened them, until they were fully open, and walked until he was on the other side of the rusted-out shell of a building and sat down, his back against the wall. Nate didn't have to wait long, because a few moments later the vampires that had been chasing him saw him, tired and out of breath. Arrow's eyes narrowed at him in contempt. "You have caused my brothers and I a lot of grief," he accused, and Nate chuckled. "Yeah," he breathed, still trying to catch his breath, "I tend to do that. Will you stop fighting and come with us?" "Doing anything more will not do you any good," Arrow stated, and Nate hung his head down low. He didn't have any chakra left, and he was physically and mentally exhausted. Really, what he needed was a nice, long nap, and maybe some ramen. His stomach rumbled in response. Ramen? He hadn't had that in ages. At least not the good stuff, made none other than by Tucci and his daughter. Man, what he wouldn't give for a bowl of that right now. He could just see it, the bowl steaming from the hot broth bath. The noodles were in all their deliciousness. "Yeah, well?" Arrow questioned, and Nate was brought back to reality. Wiping his mouth with the sleeve of his shirt for any possible drool, he shook his head. "I already told you before, Arrow, but for your sake I'll say it again. Kiss my hairy white ass." Nate spat out contemptuously. Arrow let out a low growl and moved forward, flanked by his brothers and what was left of the Volturi. "Prepare to die, young Nate." He spat back, and the blonde just drew his knees up, resting his arms against on them. "I've been ready to die for a long time now," he replied softly, watching as they drew closer, his vision already starting to blacken around the edges. As soon as the last vampire was in, the doors slammed shut. Pulled by the wires, Nate cut with the kunai behind his back, and hearing the creaky shut, along with being plunged into darkness, the vampires started to panic. "What did you do, you little fool?" Caius hissed as he truly looked around for the first time. Papers lined the wall, all with unrecognizable kanji writing on them. They were even pasted to the floor and ceiling. Why did we not see this before? Nate, feeling bored and overall tired of hearing the elder vampire's voice, decided to humor him, and answered. "You didn't see because I placed a genjutsu over the building to make it seem like we were still in the forest, and those cute little papers you're all standing on are what are as paper bombs," he finished dramatically. "We're all going to die down here, gentlemen. Have a nice trip to hell," Nate said, and lit the fuse. 3 things happened. 1. Nearly all the vampires tried to make a break for the door, all scrambling to get over each other, not wanting to die. 2. They all shrieked as the bombs tore their bodies apart, while simultaneously burning the pieces beyond all recognition. And last but not least, 3. Nate laughed at their feeble attempts as the bombs exploded around him, throwing debris around him. As Nate finally succumbed to darkness, even just to get away from the blazing inferno, the last thing he saw was Edward's face, and inwardly grimaced at how much of a fool he was around the vampire for the last few months. Of course Nate still loved him. Anybody was a fool themselves for asking such an idiotic question, but still, it was nice to dream, right? He barely made out the shape of a large, metal container, commonly used for storing water to cool the machinery, as it flew towards him and encased him in the only area of the room he was unable to cover with letter bombs because he ran out. Being plunged into further darkness, he let out one last breath, as the roof caved in on him, sealing him in.